The cradle was already closing when the readout went wrong. Tavern Yules had 4 hands inside the open channel of the girl's back, and every one of them was steady. The theater lights burned a cold surgical white across the keel steel he was seating into her, vertebra by vertebra, warship-grade alloy where the soft human column used to be. It was the 6th spine he had built this cycle. He was good at this. He had never lost one on the cradle. So when the lower monitor threw a spike it should not have thrown, his first thought was not fear. It was irritation. "Sedation slipping," he said. "Push the lattice damper, she's climbing." Behind the glass, the theater tech leaned into her console. "Damper's already at ceiling, reconstructor. She's metabolizing it." "Then she can't be." "Nobody metabolizes it." The girl's heart on the screen was not the flat, obedient line of an anesthetized asset. It was walking. Slow, patient, deliberate, a rhythm that did not belong to a body with its spinal cord unthreaded and half its nerves clamped off in the dark. Tavern's uppermost pair of hands did not stop working. A Vashariot reconstructor did not stop working. But his lower pair went still against the rail of the cradle, and for one breath he simply looked at the thing on his table. She was small. That was the first fact anyone logged about the attrition-grade stock, and it was always the least useful. 19 standard years, the intake said. Ordinary brown hair shaved to stubble at the surgical line. A scatter of old scars on her forearms that predated the directorate entirely. The kind a body earns before it is ever harvested. Her designation, stenciled on the cradle plate, read Instrument Sable 9. Her name, the thing the intake was supposed to strip and did not always fully take, was somewhere in the file under a heading nobody read. "Overseer wants an update," the tech said. "Overseer can wait until she's closed." "He's on the floor, reconstructor." Tavern looked up. Through the observation glass, past his own reflection ghosted in the daylight coming off the medbay's great dome, Prefect Karsk Val was already coming through the airlock in his gray directorate half-cloak. Unhurried, the way men are unhurried when they own the room and everyone in it. "Tell me it's seating," Karsk said, before the door had even sealed. "It's seating." Tavern sank the 9th vertebra home with a sound like a bolt finding thread. "The frame's perfect. The alloy took better than any I've built. That's the problem." "There is no problem where the alloy takes. There's a problem when the leash doesn't." Tavern tipped his crested head at the lower monitor. Karsk followed the gesture with the mild patience of a man who had never once in his life been wrong in a way that cost him. "The obedience lattice runs through the spine we build. You know this. The whole design is that she can't move without the collar moving with her. Every nerve roots through our alloy, so every nerve answers to us. That's the point of a keel steel instrument. She's not sedated because she wants to be. She's sedated because we told the lattice to hold her under. And she's holding it back." For the first time, something crossed the prefect's flat gray face, not alarm but interest, which on Karsk Val was more dangerous. "Instruments don't hold anything back. That's what the word means." "I'm aware of what the word means." Tavern withdrew his upper hands, sealed the channel with a run of biofoam, and let the cradle's inner shell fold down over the closed wound like a hand cupping a coal. "I'm telling you her body is treating our control signal as damage, and routing around it, the same way it would route around a severed tendon." Karsk was quiet a moment. On the table the girl breathed that slow walking breath. "How long until she's rated for calibration?" 3 days if she were ordinary." "She's attrition grade tier red. She is the opposite of ordinary. That is the entire reason we harvest her line and not some soft council world stock. You knew that when you took the contract." Karsk drew his cloak straight. 2 days. Calibration in 2 days. I want to see this one on the leash before the deployment board convenes. Do you understand me, reconstructor?" "I understand you." "Good." The prefect turned. At the door he paused and did not look back. "And Tavern, when you write it up she metabolized the sedation. She did not resist it. There is no line in any of my reports for an instrument that resists. The airlock took him. Tavern stood over his sixth spine of the cycle and watched the walking heartbeat walk. Ren came up out of the dark the way she had learned to come up out of everything, slowly, and without letting it show on her face. The first thing was the ceiling. It was too bright and too clean and too far away, a white dome with daylight in it, and she hated it immediately in the specific way you hate a thing that has already decided what you are. The second thing was her back. There was no pain, which was worse than pain. Where her spine should have been, there was a cold, sure line of nothing she recognized. A straightness that went from the base of her skull to her hips like a plumb weight dropped through her. And when she breathed, she felt the breath move against it and understood, with no drama at all, that they had taken her out and put something else in. She did not move, not yet. There was a voice near her, not the gray one, a different one, four-armed. She could hear it in the way the sounds got made. It was talking to a machine, not to her. Myofiber integration nominal, subdermal weave holding, alloy density at spec. A pause. You're awake. She kept her eyes on the dome. You're awake, the voice said again, and you're deciding whether to pretend you're not. I can see your occipital load on the monitor. Pretending won't help you, but I'll tell you honestly, it won't hurt you either. I'm not the one who hurts you. I'm the one who built you. Ren turned her head. It moved easily. Everything moved easily, which frightened the part of her that was still keeping score. The alien was tall and folded-looking, four arms tucked against a narrow chitin-plated frame, a bony crest running back over a face that was mostly eyes. It was not looking at her the way the gray ones people looked at the stock, as inventory. It was looking at her the way she had once, as a girl, looked at a lock she couldn't pick. You have a name, it said. It's in your file, they didn't fully strip it. That happens with your line, the stripping doesn't take clean. Two of its hands moved over the console, the other two stayed folded. I'm going to do something I'm not supposed to do, and tell you what I did to you, because in about 40 hours a man named Karsk Val is going to spend a great deal of effort convincing you that you belong to him, and I would rather you belong to the truth first. Ren said nothing. She was cataloging the room, door, glass, the angle of the cradle, the way the alloy in her back made her feel heavy and light at once, like a blade that had just remembered it was a blade. I replaced your spine, the surgeon said, with the same alloy we lay in the keels of warships, every vertebra. It's threaded with a control lattice, the directorate calls it the collar. When they send the signal, your body is supposed to answer it before you do. Pain, stillness, obedience. That's what you're for now. You're an instrument. He paused. Except your body doesn't like the signal, it's already fighting it. I've never seen that. I've built 9 of these. You're the first one that's fighting. For a long moment, the girl on the table just breathed her slow, walking breath. Then she said, in a voice rusty from the tube they'd had down her throat, Ren. What? My name. She looked at the ceiling again, and something in her jaw settled, the way a stone settles when it finds the bottom of a well. It's Ren. Write it down. You said you'd rather I belong to the truth first. A beat. So write down the true thing. Tavern Yules looked at her for a moment that went on longer than his training allowed. Then, with one of his lower hands on the flat of the cradle plate where the stencil said Instrument Sable 9, he wrote, in the small, careful script of a caste that documents everything, a single human word. He would think about that later, that it was the first order he ever took from her, and that he did not notice it was an order until it was already done. They gave her 2 days, and Ren spent them learning her own body like a burglar learning a house. They thought she was resting. The lattice logged her as compliant, heart low, motion low, a good quiet asset healing on schedule. What the lattice could not log was the thing she was actually doing, which was small and constant and invisible, pressing on the cold line in her back, feeling for its edges, learning which parts of her still answered to her, and which parts had started answering to something else. because the surgeon had been right and she had felt it before he'd said it. There was a wrongness in her now, a second will laid over her own like a wet cloth over a face, and every time she moved she felt the cloth try to move with her. When she lifted her hand, there was a hair's-breadth pause, a customs check before it obeyed. The directorate's signal, reading her intent, deciding whether to allow it. She did not fight the cloth. She had learned, on a world the directorate filed under a color and a number, that you do not fight the thing that is stronger than you. You wait it out. You find the seam. The seam was the alloy. It took her most of the first day to understand it, and when she did she almost laughed, except laughing showed on the monitor. They had built her a spine of Warship metal because Warship metal does not bend, does not break, does not care what you shoot at it. And they had run their leash through it because it was the strongest thing in her, and a leash wants to be anchored in the strongest thing. But the alloy did not care about their signal any more than it cared about a bullet. It was inert. It was a wall. And a wall, she was beginning to understand, works in both directions. If she pushed her attention down into the metal, into the cold sure line of it, the customs check got slower. The cloth over her face got thinner. The alloy did not conduct the leash the way flesh would have. It insulated. They had, in their certainty, given her the one material in the room that did not want to obey them either. She practiced. Lift a finger, feel the pause, sink her attention into the alloy, feel the pause shorten. By the end of the first day, the pause was half what it had been. By the middle of the second day, when a med tech came to check the wound and told her, not unkindly, to hold still, she held still, and the holding still was entirely her own idea, and the lattice logged it as obedience, and she let it. Let them think the leash was working. Let them tighten it. A leash you know about is a leash you can plan around. She was ready. In the small, cold way she measured readiness. When the door opened on the morning of the third day, and Karsk Val came in to meet his new instrument. Karsk had processed 416 instruments across his career, and he had a system for the first meeting, because the first meeting was where the asset learned the shape of its world. You did not threaten them. Threat implied they had a choice and an instrument had no choice. Threat was for equals. You simply demonstrated. You sent a low pulse down the collar, nothing cruel, just a firm hand on the back of the neck, and you watched the new asset's body answer before its mind could, watched it kneel or still or flinch on the directorate's command and not its own, and you watched the understanding arrive in its eyes. That was the moment. That was when they stopped being a person and started being a tool. He had seen it 416 times. He rather enjoyed it in the flat way he enjoyed anything. He came into the recovery cell with a data slate under his arm and the reconstructor trailing him, and he looked at the girl sitting on the edge of the cradle, small, shaved, ordinary, watching him with a face that had no fear in it and no defiance either, just attention, the way a scale watches a weight, and he thumbed the control on his slate and sent the pulse down her collar. "Kneel," he said. The word and the signal went out together, the way he'd sent them 416 times. And the girl looked at him and did not kneel. Karsk did not, at first, believe what he was seeing. He had watched the signal leave the slate. He had felt the familiar half-second of nothing, the transmission crossing the room, and then the part he'd stopped bothering to watch years ago because it was as reliable as gravity, the asset folding. 416 times the fold. And now there was a girl sitting on a cradle with her hands loose on her knees, looking at him, not kneeling. He sent it again. He did not say the word this time. The word was theater. He sent the raw command, harder, a pulse that should have dropped her whether her mind agreed or not, because that was the entire architecture. The collar answered before the mind. He sent it into the keel steel spine his reconstructor had bolted into her, and the keel steel spine took it and did nothing with it, the way a wall takes a shout. "Reconstructor," Karsk said very evenly, "your collar isn't seating." The collar seated perfectly. Tavrin was watching the girl, not the prefect. "I told you, she's routing around it." "That's not possible." "You keep saying that word. Ren's voice was quiet, unbothered, almost bored, and it stopped the room the way a dropped tool stops a workshop. She flexed her fingers, watching the customs check pause that used to live between her intent and her hand and finding it nearly gone. I've heard it a lot. On my world, too. Somebody in armor stands over you and says a thing isn't possible, right up until it is. She looked at Karsk with that scales-eye attention. You put a wall in my back. Walls don't take orders. For one long breath, Prefect Karsk Val and Instrument Sable 9 looked at each other, and Tavern Yule stood between them and understood, with the particular clarity of a man watching two weather systems meet, that he had built something the Directorate did not have a word for. Then Karsk smiled, because Karsk always had a second move. 200 milliamps through the primary column, he said to the slate, and pressed his thumb down. The pulse he sent then was not an order. It was pain, the compliance charge, the thing that lived in the collar for assets who needed the shape of the world drawn for them in a harder line. It ran the length of the keel steel and dumped itself into every nerve still wired to the alloy, and it was designed to fold a full-grown warrior-caste soldier into a whimpering ball, and Tavern actually stepped back from the cradle, because he did not want to be near what it would do to a 19-year-old. Ren's jaw tightened. A muscle in her shaved temple stood out. Her hands closed slowly on her knees. And she stayed sitting up. Higher, she said through her teeth, in that same low voice, not a taunt, not defiance, just information, the way you'd tell a man his engine was undertuned. If you're going to do it, higher. I felt worse than this before you people ever found me. Karsk's thumb came off the slate. The room was very quiet. The daylight moved in the dome. On the monitor, the girl's heart walked its slow, patient walk, unhurried, exactly as it had walked on the cradle with her spine open to the air. Get her rated for the arena, Karsk said finally, and his voice had changed, not softer but more careful, the voice of a man who has revised an estimate. If the collar won't hold her yet, the walls will, and the exercises will show me what she is. He turned to go, then stopped and looked back at Tavern, and for the first time in their long professional acquaintance the prefect said a thing that was almost honest. You built her too well, reconstructor. Fix it. The airlock sealed behind him. Tavern looked at the girl looked at Tavern. He's going to try to break me now, Ren said. It was not a question. Yes. Good. She lay back down on the cradle, unhurried, and closed her eyes, and the lattice logged her as compliant. I do better when they try. They took her to the arena on the 4th day, and the arena was where the Directorate found out what a tier-red body could do when it stopped pretending to be inventory. Tavern was required to attend. All reconstructors attended their assets calibration. It was how the cast learned. He stood in the observation gallery above a wide daylit chamber floored in impact plate, the great filtered sun of the station world pouring down through the ceiling louvers, and he watched them run Ren through the exercises that had rated 415 instruments before her. And he took notes, because taking notes was the only thing that kept his 4 hands from curling. The first exercise was the drop. A calibrated fall 3 body lengths onto impact plate, a test of the alloy's integration, meant to be survived, not enjoyed. Assets came out of it braced and shaking. Ren came out of it the way a dropped wrench comes out of it. She hit, she rolled, she stood, and she looked up at the gallery to see if there would be anything else. The keel steel had taken the fall and passed it into the plate and given her back nothing but the information that she had landed. The technician at Tavern's elbow made a small sound. The second exercise was pressure. They put her in the crush frame, the hydraulic yoke that measured an asset's structural threshold, how much load the augmented frame could bear before the flesh failed around the alloy. The needle climbed. Assets tapped out at 4, at 5. A good warrior cast build reached 7. The needle went to 8. And Ren stood in the yoke with the great arms of it grinding down on her shoulders and her breath coming slow and even, and she said, to no one, "You'll run out of numbers before I run out of standing." They stopped it at 11 because the frame was rated to 12, and the shift supervisor did not want to explain a broken frame. Reconstructor, the technician's voice had gone thin. Is that the alloy or is that her? It's both, Tavern said and wrote it down and underlined it and did not know yet why he underlined it. The alloy carries the load, but something has to keep standing in the frame while it does. The alloy can't do that part. That part is hers. The third exercise was the one Karsk came down to watch. They called it live proof. Officially, it verified an instrument's subdermal weave against small arms fire. A deployment asset had to be able to take a round without going down, and the exercise proved the augmentation to the deployment board. Unofficially, everyone in the gallery knew it was the exercise where the asset learned in the plainest possible language that its body was no longer its own, that it could be shot and would not be permitted to die, that even death was a privilege the directorate had taken. They stood her against the far wall in the daylight. A warrior-caste marksman took position at 40 meters, a blue chitinous soldier with a service sidearm, and the bored competence of someone who had done this to a lot of assets. Karsk came to the gallery rail beside Tavrin, unhurried, and watched. This is the one that settles them, the prefect said, quietly, almost to himself. The others were her body arguing with our machine. This is her body arguing with the world. Nobody argues with a bullet. Down on the floor, the marksman raised the sidearm. Ren, against the wall in the pouring daylight, did the thing that no instrument in 415 calibrations had ever done at live proof. She got bored. Tavern saw it happen. He was watching her face. He was always watching her face now. It had become a professional problem, and he saw the exact moment the girl decided the exercise was not worth her attention. Her eyes went from the marksman to the louvers overhead, to the daylight coming through, to a small bird thing of the station world that had gotten in through the vents and was tracking back and forth along a ceiling beam looking for the way out. She watched the bird thing. She was still watching it when the marksman fired. The round took her high in the chest, dead center on the sternum, at 40 meters, from a service weapon that could punch a warrior-caste breastplate. It flattened against her and fell to the floor. It did not stagger her. It did not turn her. It made a small bright sound, metal meeting the anchored weave over her sternum, a sound like a coin dropped on stone, and the ruined slug spun on the impact plate and lay still, and Ren looked down at it, mildly, the way you'd look at a bug that had flown into you, and then went back to watching the bird thing on the beam. The gallery was silent. Karsk's hands were very still on the rail. Again, the prefect said. The marksman fired again, twice, 3 times, 4. Chest, chest, shoulder, the long muscle of the thigh placed professional, each round enough to end an ordinary body. Each round flattened and fell. The floor around Ren's feet filled slowly with spent, ruined metal, a small scatter of it, bright in the daylight, and she stood in the middle of it with her arms loose and her attention up on the ceiling, and let the bird thing show her the way the exercise was supposed to end. With something small and trapped and unimpressed finding the vent, and going out and being gone. When the marksman lowered the weapon, not on command, just because there did not seem to be a point, Ren finally looked back down. Not at Karsk. At the surgeon in the gallery, at Tavrin, and she held his eyes for a moment across the bright, empty air, and then she looked, deliberately, down at the scatter of dead bullets around her boots. She did not say anything. She did not have to. Tavrin wrote, in the small, careful script of a cast that documents everything. The rounds fell off, and under it, before he could stop the hand that wrote it, he added the observation that was not medical, that had no line in any of Karsk's reports, that would eventually cost Tavrin Yules everything he had spent his life building. She was watching a bird. Karsk convened the deployment board a day early. He did it, Tavrin understood, because he was frightened, and because a frightened prefect does not slow down, he speeds up. He gets the thing raided and shipped and out of his medbay and turned into somebody else's problem before the wrongness of it can be written into a record with his name on it. Karsk did not have a line for an instrument that argued with bullets. So he would deploy her, quickly, to the one place her body was built to be sent, and let the deployment answer the question the arena hadn't. The board met in a daylit chamber high in the station, a ring of directorate casts around a hollow well, the great filtered sun laying bright bars across the table through the dome. Tavrin attended as builder of record. He was not asked to speak. He listened to them discuss the asset called Sable 9 as one discusses a tool that has come in slightly out of tolerance and might yet be useful, and he watched the Hollowell turn up the file, and he watched them decide. Attrition grade Tier Red, the logistics cast read out. Source World Register, AG 8, the Red Register. A pause and the small distaste every directorate throat put into those words. The pacification of AG8 is behind schedule. The native stock is resistant. We've lost 3 harvest teams this cycle. The soft approach isn't taking. We stop being soft, Karsk said. We send them one of their own, rebuilt, loyal, unbreakable. Let the Red Register watch a daughter of theirs walk through their fire and put down their resistance for us. Nothing pacifies a resistant world like the sight of its own children turned. It ends the argument. It's the whole reason we build from Tier Red stock and not from softer lines, because only their bodies can survive their world, and only the sight of their bodies turned against them can break their will. The board murmured. It was, Tavrin had to admit, an elegant piece of cruelty. Send the Deathworlder home wearing the Directorate's collar, and let her own people learn from her that resistance was over. Is the asset loyal? The logistics cast asked. The calibration notes are incomplete. Every eye in the daylit chamber turned to Tavrin Yules, builder of record, the only one in the room who had watched the girl watch a bird while the bullets fell off her, the only one who knew what the incomplete notes were incomplete about. He opened his mouth to tell them the truth. And then he thought about the recovery cell, and the word he'd written on the cradle plate where the stencil said instrument Sable 9, and the girl's flat voice saying write down the true thing, and he found that the truth he wanted to tell them was not the truth they were asking for. The asset is unbreakable, Tavrin said. That much is verified. The rest, loyalty, is a calibration outcome, not a build spec. You wanted her unbreakable. She's the most unbreakable thing I've ever built. He let that sit. Deploy her to AG8 and you'll find out exactly how loyal she is. It was, he would reflect later, the first lie he had ever told the Directorate. And like the word on the cradle plate, he did not notice it was a lie until it was already out of his mouth, and by then it was too late to be anything else. The board voted. Sable 9 was rated for deployment to the Red Register. They gave her 3 days to finish integrating. They should not have given her 3 hours. On the first of her 3 days, before they made the mistake of walking her past the integration wing, they ran the loyalty verification, because deployment protocol required it, and Karsk was a man who required his protocols even when he had stopped believing in them. The verification was simple, and it was the cruelest thing in the Directorate's whole handbook precisely because it was so simple. You did not test an instrument's loyalty with questions. Questions were for people. You tested it with an order it would refuse if there were any person left inside, and then you watched whether the collar overrode the refusal. That was the whole of loyalty to the Directorate, not that the asset wanted to obey, that it could not do otherwise. They brought Ren to a small daylit chamber off the arena, and they put another asset in front of her, a warrior cast build, finished, straight-backed and pleasant and empty, one of the wing's own, an instrument that had been on the leash so long there was nothing behind the nothing at all. They put a shock baton in Ren's hand. And Karsk, watching from behind the glass with Tavrin beside him, sent the order down her collar and spoke it aloud at the same time, the way he had sent Neil, the way he had sent it 416 times. Strike him, the prefect said. Once, Across the face, prove the collar holds and you deploy tomorrow. Refuse and you prove nothing and we run the correction tonight. Ren looked at the baton in her hand. She looked at the emptied warrior caste build standing pleasant and still in front of her, waiting to be struck, incapable of flinching because flinching was the body arguing it should be treated better, and this body had lost the argument years ago. She felt the order come down the wire and into the wall in her back, and she felt the wall do to it what the wall did to everything: take it, and hold it out, and give it nothing. She set the baton down on the floor. "No," she said, not defiant, not angry, just the plain flat fact of it, the way you decline a second helping. "He's already down. You want me to hit a man you already emptied to prove I'll hit whoever you point me at. I won't. Not him, not the ones on my world you're going to point me at next. That's the whole reason you built me, and it's the one thing the wall you gave me is never going to do." She stepped back from the baton. "Run your correction. I ate the last one. I'll eat this one too. But I'm not going to hit him, and you can send that signal down my collar until you run out of collar, and all it's going to do is prove to your own board on your own record that the leash doesn't hold me." She looked through the glass directly at Karsk, the scale reading the weight. "You keep testing whether I'll obey. You should be testing something else. You should be testing whether I have a reason to. And I don't. You never gave me one. You just gave me a wall and assumed the wall would be enough." Behind the glass, Karsk's hand was very still on the slate. "It was always enough before," he said, and it came out of him before he could stop it. And it was the most honest thing the prefect had said in 416 names. The small, bewildered admission of a man whose entire science had just declined, in a small daylit room, to be a science. "Before," Ren said, "you only ever tested the ones you'd already killed. Dead things always pass. That's not loyalty, Karsk, that's just quiet." She turned her back on the glass, which no asset had ever done to a prefect, and looked at the emptied warrior caste build she had refused to strike, and something in her face changed, not softened but focused, the way it had focused on the boy she had not yet met. "This is what you make. This is the corpse you've been calling obedience. And you were going to send me home to make more of him out of my own people and call it winning." She was quiet a moment. "You should run the correction tonight. You should do it while you still think it'll work. Because the morning after it doesn't, everything you built is going to start coming apart, and I'd rather you spent it certain than spent it afraid." She walked to the door of the small chamber and waited to be taken back to her cell. And behind the glass tavern Yules watched Prefect Karsk Val stare at the baton on the floor and the asset who would not lift it. And the surgeon understood, earlier than Karsk did, earlier than the board would, earlier than the fleet, that the verification had not failed. It had worked perfectly. It had verified, beyond any doubt, exactly what the girl was, and exactly what she was not, and exactly what would happen when they sent her home. The Directorate had built a test to find the person still hiding inside an asset, so it could be sure there was none. And for the first time in 416 names, the test had found one, standing in the daylight with a baton at her feet, refusing. And the men who read the result were too certain of their own science to understand that it had just told them the truth. Karsk did not run the correction that night. That was the part Tavern would turn over for years afterward, that the prefect, for one day, hesitated. He rated her for deployment, he gave her the 3 days protocol required, and he told himself the collar would seat as the integration finished, because a man who has been right 416 times does not abandon his science on the strength of a single baton left lying on a floor. He waited. He let the days run. He would not wait long, but the waiting was enough to hand the girl the one thing she had been asking the wall in her back for since the cradle, which was time. And Ren, who had learned on a hard, bright world exactly what to do with time, spent it the way she spent everything, coldly, completely, and entirely on her own terms. The integration wing was where the Directorate kept the ones it had already finished. Ren had not been meant to see it. Assets healed in isolation and shipped in isolation. The whole system, ran on the principle that a tool never learned it was one of many. But on the second day of her 3, a medtech moved her through the wing on the way to a scan she did not need, a scheduling error, a corridor closed for maintenance, the small human failures that even a directorate could not fully engineer out. And for 90 seconds Ren walked down a bright hall lined with recovery cells and saw, through the glass, what she was 3 days from becoming. They were sitting up in their cradles, every one of them in the good posture the collar gave. Straight-backed, still, faces smooth and pleasant and empty, hands folded, waiting for a signal to tell them what a hand was for. A dozen of them. More. Warrior caste builds and scholarly builds, and in the last cells, human ones, Deathworlders like her, taken from worlds the directorate filed under colors and numbers, rebuilt around alloy and threaded with the leash, and then finished. Emptied. The wall in the back and nothing behind it. The medtech kept walking, Ren did not. In the second-to-last cell, there was a boy. He was 12, maybe, human. His build was newer than the others, the surgical line still fresh at the base of his skull, the way hers was. He was sitting up straight and still and pleasant like all the rest, hands folded. And for one moment as she passed he turned his head and looked at her, and there was nothing in his eyes, nothing at all. The collar had gotten all the way in, and then something moved behind the nothing. Just a flicker. A boy remembering for half a second that he had once been a boy. His mouth opened. He said one word, in a language the directorate's translators were not listening for, a language from a world under a color and a number. "Home," the boy said to the stranger in the corridor, and then the flicker went out, and the collar smoothed his face back to pleasant, and he folded his hands, and he was inventory again. The medtech tugged her arm. "Move along, Sable." Ren moved along. She was very quiet on the scan table. She was quiet on the walk back. She lay down in her own cradle in her own bright cell and let the lattice log her as compliant, heart low, motion low, a good asset resting on schedule. And under the surface, in the cold sure line of alloy in her back, she stopped planning her own escape and started planning something larger, because she had just learned the shape of the thing she was inside, and the shape of it was this. They did not take her spine to make one weapon. They took a whole world's children and made them into hands that would put down their own homes. The boy in the second-to-last cell would be shipped to a world under a color and a number and set upon his own people, and he would do it, because the collar would tell him to, and there would be nothing left behind the nothing to say no. Ren had spent 2 days learning to be the wall in her own back. Now she started learning how to make the wall bigger. Tavern found her staring at the ceiling that night, and made a mistake he would be glad of for the rest of his life. He came to check the integration, a legitimate reason, the only reason he had left to be in her cell after hours, and he ran the scans and read the alloy density and the weave tension, all nominal, all perfect. And then instead of leaving he stood there with his 4 hands folded and said the thing he had not said to the board. "They're going to send you home." I know, she did not look away from the dome, "to put down my own people so the rest of them stop fighting." A pause. "You told the board I was loyal." "I told the board you were unbreakable. I let them assume the rest." Tavern sat, which a reconstructor did not do in an asset cell, on the low stool by the console. "I've built 9 of you. I told myself the first 8 didn't feel it because by the time I was done there was nothing left in them to feel it. That's the design. We empty the cell before we build the tool. You're the 9th. He looked at his hands, all 4 of them, the hands that had done it. "You're the first one I couldn't empty, and I've spent 3 days telling myself that's a defect. It isn't a defect. It's the only honest thing in this building." Ren turned her head and looked at him, the scale weighing the weight. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because in 1 more day I'm supposed to sign the deployment order that ships you to your own world to become the boy in the second-to-last cell." Tavern's voice did not rise. A Vashariot voice rarely rose. "And I find that I would rather be the man who told you the truth than the man who signed that order. It's a small distinction. It's probably the last one I'll get to make. He stood. The collar roots through the alloy I built into you. You've already learned that the alloy insulates you from the signal. That's why the leash won't hold. What you haven't learned, because I never wrote it in a file where an asset could read it, is that the lattice has a root. A single junction where the whole leash ties into your nervous system, low in the column where the alloy meets what's left of you. Sever that and the collar has nothing to hold. It becomes what it's made of, inert metal in your back, yours. Ren was very still. You'd tell me how to cut your own leash. I tell you where it's tied. Tavrin moved to the door. The cutting is yours. Everything after the cutting is yours. I only build. I don't get to decide what I've built does. That was the deal I made with myself a long time ago, and it was a coward's deal, and I'm too old to unmake it now. He paused at the airlock. But I can tell you where the knot is. And I can lose a scan and misfile a schedule and be looking the other way at the right hour, because those are a coward's tools and I know how to use them very well. The door opened. You have one day, Ren. When they come to prep you for transport, the leash will be armed and the guards will be armored and the walls will be rated to hold something far stronger than a girl. Be stronger than the walls. He left, the airlock sealed. The lattice logged the asset as resting, heart low, motion low. In the cold, sure line of alloy in her back, Ren found the knot. Karsk Val did not sleep the night before the deployment, and he was not a caste that needed much sleep, so this was itself a kind of alarm. He sat in his office high in the station with the daylight going long and gold through the dome, and he read, for the fourth time, the calibration file on Sable 9, and the fourth time it read the same as the first, incomplete. The reconstructor's notes were technically flawless and told him nothing. Alloy density, nominal. Weave, nominal. Load threshold, exceeds frame. Live proof, verified. And then at the bottom in the small, careful script of the builder cast, 2 lines that were not in the format, that had no field, that Karsk had read 40 times. The rounds fell off. She was watching a bird. He was a man who had processed 416 instruments, and he had learned to read the sentence a report was refusing to say. This report was refusing to say she isn't loyal, and Karsk knew it, and he also knew that he had already voted to deploy her, and that reversing the vote meant explaining to the board why he'd raided her in the first place, and that a prefect who admitted he could not hold his own asset was a prefect who did not stay a prefect. So he did what frightened men in high offices have always done. He decided the problem was solvable by force, and he sent for a correction. The correction was the last tool in the collar, and the directorate did not use it often, because it was expensive and it left the asset diminished. It was a full lattice surge, every fiber of the leash driven to its ceiling at once. A controlled burn meant to scorch out whatever in the asset was still capable of resisting and leave behind only the parts that obeyed. It did not kill, it hollowed. It was how you turned a defiant asset into a compliant one, and it was how Karsk understood without needing it spelled out. The boy in the second-to-last cell had gotten the way he was. Run the correction on Sable 9 at the shift change, Karsk told the theater tech. Full ceiling. I want her pleasant by morning. I want her folding when I say kneel. Whatever the reconstructor built into her, burn it out. The deployment stands. That's Reconstructor Yules signed off on her integration this evening, Prefect. Protocol says the builder attends any correction. The reconstructor is off shift. This is directorate business, not medical. Run it. Karsk turned back to the gold light in the dome. And log it as a scheduled recalibration. There's no line in my reports for burning out an asset that argued with a bullet, and I don't intend to write one. At the shift change in the cell where the lattice logged the asset as resting, they ran the correction. Tavrin was not there. Tavrin had lost a scan and misfiled a schedule and gone home, exactly as he'd said he would, and he would not learn until morning what they had done in his absence, and he would carry it the rest of his life. Ren was awake when it came. She had been awake for a long time, lying still in the cradle with her attention sunk all the way down into the cold, sure line of her back, at the knot, at the single junction where the surgeon said the whole leash tied into what was left of her. She had spent the day finding it and the night learning it, not cutting it, not yet, because a leash you've cut is a leash they know is cut, and she wanted them to keep thinking they held it right up until the moment they found out they never had. She was patient. She had been patient on a world under a color and a number, waiting out things far stronger than a leash. So when the surge came, when every fiber of the collar drove to its ceiling at once, the controlled burn, the thing that had emptied the boy, it found her already down in the alloy, already at the knot, already braced. It hurt. She would not pretend afterward, even to herself, that it did not hurt. It was the worst thing the directorate had poured into her all at once, and for a span of time she could not measure. She was nothing but the hurt, a girl on fire from the inside along a line of Warship metal, her jaw locked, and the muscles of her shaved temple standing out and her hands closed white on the edges of the cradle. But the alloy did not conduct it the way flesh would have. The alloy insulated. The wall in her back took the fire and held most of it out, the way it had held out the bullets, the way it had held out the leash from the first hour, and what got through was terrible and survivable. And Wren had spent her whole short life learning the exact and narrow difference between terrible and survivable, and living in it. The surge climbed to its ceiling and held. On the theater monitor, the tech watched the asset's reading spike into the range where the others had hollowed, and waited for the line to smooth, for the good, pleasant emptiness to arrive. The line did not smooth. The asset's heart on the screen walked its slow, patient walk, up through the fire and out the other side, unhurried, exactly as it had walked on the cradle with her spine open to the air. And down in the alloy at the knot, in the middle of the worst thing they had, Wren made a decision she had been saving. She had planned to cut the leash quietly at the last hour when they came to prep her for transport, to let them keep believing right up until it mattered. But the boy in the second-to-last cell was going to be shipped to a world under a color and a number, and they had just tried to make her into him, and she understood now that there was no quiet hour coming, that the directorate did not run out of corrections. That patience had a floor and she had just hit it. So instead of cutting the knot, she took hold of it. She did not sever the leash. She reached down into the cold, sure line of her back, to the junction where the whole collar tied into what was left of her, and instead of cutting their signal off, she took the surge they were pouring into her, all of it, the full ceiling, the worst thing they had, and she stopped letting the wall hold it out. She let it in, and she sent it back up the wire. She did not send back power. She had none to send. She was a girl on a table, not a reactor. What she sent back was attention. The surge had opened the channel. For the leash to pour its worst into her, the whole length of the wire had to be live, from the theater console down through the wing's common junction and into the knot in her back. And a live wire runs in both directions for anyone patient enough and stubborn enough to keep hold of the far end while it burns. Wren kept hold. While the correction poured fire into her and the alloy held most of it out, she followed the fire back the way it had come, up out of the knot, up the wire, through the common junction, into the addressing of the whole system, and she read it, the way you read a river by wading up it in the dark, one cold step at a time. She learned the wing. She learned that every collar in the integration wing tied into the same common junction, because a correction was a network event, and the theater ran them all off one board. She learned the addressing of every cell the warrior caste builds, the scholarly builds, the human ones taken from worlds under colors and numbers. She learned the address of the second-to-last cell, the boy, 12 years old, who had said the word home to a stranger in a corridor and then gone smooth again. She learned it all in the span of a correction that was supposed to empty her, and it did not empty her. It taught her the shape of the leash from the inside of every throat it held. Then she let go of the wire and lay still, and let her reading smooth toward the pleasant emptiness the tech was waiting for. She gave them the fold, 416 assets had given the directorate the fold, and now the 417th gave it too, a beautiful textbook correction outcome. The defiant asset going quiet and even and compliant, her heart settling, her face smoothing. The tech let out a breath she'd been holding for a long time and logged it. Correction successful, asset compliant, deployment stands. She did not look closely at the trace under the smoothing, the slow walking heartbeat that had not changed through any of it, because you do not look closely at good news. Ren lay in the dark of her cell wearing the mask of an emptied girl, and behind the mask she held the address of every leash in the wing, and she waited for morning, because there was one more thing she wanted before she moved, and it would come to her cell on its own. Tavern came at first light, and he came running, which a reconstructor did not do. He had learned of the correction the moment his shift began. It was in the overnight log, filed as a scheduled recalibration, the way Karsk had ordered, and it had taken Tavern exactly the length of time to read the words full ceiling to understand what had been done to the girl in his absence and what it meant. They had run the surge that emptied the boy. They had done it while he was home being a coward with a coward's tools, losing scans and misfiling schedules, and none of it had mattered because the one thing he had not planned for was that the directorate would simply reach past him and hollow her out. He came through the airlock of her cell braced to find the boy in the second-to-last cell all over again. The good posture, the folded hands, the smooth, pleasant nothing where a girl named Ren used to be. He came to see what his cowardice had cost. She was sitting on the edge of the cradle, small and shaved and ordinary, and she looked up at him with a face that had no emptiness in it at all and said, "You're late. They already tried it." Tavern stopped in the doorway. All four of his hands went still. "The correction," he said. "Full ceiling," the log said. "It hurt." Ren said it the way she said everything, flat, informational, a girl telling a man his engine was undertuned. "It hurt more than anything they've done. I let it in and I followed it home, and now I know where every leash in this wing ties off." She stood. She was not shaking. "You told me where my knot was. Thank you. I found all the others while they were busy burning me." For a long moment the surgeon simply looked at the thing he had built and failed to empty, and something happened in his chest that he had no medical word for, that had no field in any file, and he understood that whatever he had spent his life being, builder, reconstructor, coward with a coward's tools, he was about to stop being it. "What do you need?" Tavern said. Not a question, an offer, the first honest offer of his life. "Two things." Ren moved to the door and looked down the bright hall toward the wing where the finished one sat straight-backed and pleasant and waiting. "I need the theater board unlocked, because the addressing runs through it and I can reach the whole wing from one console instead of one cell at a time. And I need you to be looking the other way when the guards come, because they are going to come, and I don't want to have to think about you while I deal with them. The board's biometric. It only opens for a reconstructor or the prefect." "You're a reconstructor." Tavern looked at his four hands. The hands that had unthreaded 8 human spines and emptied 8 cells before they ever met a girl who wouldn't empty. "Yes," he said. "I am." He turned toward the theater. "The board's this way. Karsk convenes the deployment escort at midday, armored, leash-armed, walls rated to hold something far stronger than you. If we're going to do this, it has to be before midday, and once I open that board there's no line in any report that makes me anything but what I'm about to become." "And what's that?" Tavern Yules, builder of record, walked out of the cell of the 9th spine he had built, the one he could not empty, and did not look back. "Honest," he said, "late and honest, come on." The theater board opened for his hand, as it had opened 416 times, and this time it opened for the wrong reason, and it did not know the difference. Ren stood at the console in the daylit theater with the great filtered sun coming down through the louvers, and she put her hand flat on the addressing panel, and she reached down into the cold sure line of her back, to the knot, to the far end of the wire she had learned in the fire, and she spoke to the wing on the leash's own frequency. She did not send an order. She had spent 4 days learning exactly how much she hated orders. She sent the one thing the collar was built to make impossible, the one signal that had no field in any directorate report, the thing the surge had taught her the shape of by being its exact opposite. She sent release. Down the wire through the common junction, into the addressing of every cell in the integration wing, the girl who would not be emptied sent the collars the command to let go. Not to obey her instead of the directorate, that was just a shorter leash. To let go. To fall inert. To become what they were made of, cold metal in a spine, and give the throats they held back to the ones who owned them. In the second-to-last cell, the boy who had said home to a stranger in a corridor felt the wall in his back go quiet. He did not know what to do with it at first. The finished ones never did. The collar had been the only thing telling them what a hand was for. He sat straight-backed and pleasant and still, the way the collar had left him, and then, very slowly, in the manner of a man waking in a house he does not recognize, he unfolded his hands. He looked at them. He turned one over. And something came up behind the nothing in his eyes and stayed this time, did not flicker out, because there was no longer a signal to smooth it away. And the boy from a world under a color and a number began, silently, in a bright cell in a directorate station, to weep, which is a thing the finished ones cannot do, because weeping is the body arguing that it should have been treated better, and an emptied body has lost the argument. All down the wing, in a dozen cells and more, the finished ones came back, not all at once. Not all the way, for some of them. The correction had been run on a few of them long ago and taken more than it should have, and those would need building back in ways Tavern did not yet know how to do and would spend the rest of his life learning. But the leashes fell quiet, one after another, and the straight-backed pleasant stillness broke into a dozen different human and inhuman postures of confusion and grief and slow returning selfhood, and the integration wing of the directorate station filled, for the first time in its existence, with the sound of assets remembering they were people. Tavern stood at the theater glass and watched it happen and could not speak. Wren took her hand off the panel. "That's the first thing," she said. "Now the guards." Because the theater board, when it opened, had thrown an alert the girl had known it would throw and had not bothered to prevent, because she wanted them to come. High in the station, in an office where the daylight went long and gold, Prefect Karskval saw the entire integration wing drop off the leash at once, and he did the thing frightened men in high offices have always done. He sent everything he had. The guards came through the wing's main airlock in a wedge of 8, and they came the way the directorate always came, certain. Karsk had sent his own detail, warrior caste security in full riot plate, blue chitinous and heavy, the ones who broke uprisings on penal worlds and had never once failed to break one. They came in fast and low with shock lances and service sidearms, a wedge built to take a corridor and hold it, and they found the corridor already occupied by a small shaved girl, standing between them and a dozen confused, weeping, half-returned people, and their commander did what his training told him to do with a single unarmed asset in his path. He ordered the wedge to fire. Wren did not take cover, because there was no cover behind her that would not also be the freed ones, and she had not spent 4 days learning her own body to spend it hiding. She stepped forward into the wedge's fire, and she put herself between the guns and the wing, and the corridor filled with the sound of a service volley at close range, and every round of it flattened and fell. It was not like the arena. In the arena, the marksman had placed his shots and she had watched a bird. Here it was 8 weapons at once, a wall of fire in a closed corridor, rounds meant to shred a barricade, and they hit her from the shoulders to the shins and made the small bright coin-on-stone sound over and over, a dozen at a time, and the anchored weave took every one of them and gave back nothing but ruined metal raining down around her boots. She walked into it. She did not run, did not roll, did not do any of the things a body does when it is afraid of a bullet, because she was not anymore a body that could be afraid of a bullet, and the certainty went out of the wedge like air out of a cut line. The commander stopped firing first. You cannot keep firing at a thing that is not slowing down. Some old animal part of the brain overrides the training and tells you to save the ammunition for something that can die. He stopped, and then the wedge stopped, one by one, and in the sudden quiet of the corridor the girl was still walking toward them through a scatter of dead bullets, unhurried, her heart on no monitor now but walking all the same. "Stand down," Ren said. It was not loud, it carried. "You don't want what happens next, I don't either. Stand down and this stays boring for you." The commander was warrior caste, and warrior caste did not stand down, and so he did the second thing his training told him, which was to close the distance and use the lances, because a shock lance did not fire a slug that could flatten, it drove current, and current found nerves, and even an unbreakable asset had nerves. He was right about that. The lances hurt. When the wedge closed and drove the lances into her, the current found what the alloy did not insulate and lit it, and Ren's jaw locked and the muscle stood out in her shaved temple, the same as it had under the correction, and for one moment the freed ones behind her saw the girl who had walked through 8 guns falter. And then she took the nearest lance out of the nearest guard's hands. She did not do it dramatically. That was the thing Tavrin would remember, watching from the theater glass, that she did it the way you take a tool from an apprentice who is using it wrong, a small economical motion, a turn of the wrist and a step, and the lance was hers and the guard was on the floor with his arm bent a way it was not built to bend, and he was screaming, and she had already moved to the next one. She did not kill them. She was very precise about not killing them, which was somehow worse to watch than if she had, because it meant she was choosing, every time in the middle of it, with a cold, clear attention that never once tipped into rage. An arm, a knee. The soft place behind a chitin plate where a warrior caste build kept a nerve cluster. She took the wedge apart the way she had taken her own body apart in the 2 days of learning it, methodically, patiently, finding the seam and pressing on it until it gave. It lasted perhaps a minute. When it was over, 8 warrior caste security lay in the corridor in various postures of ruin, alive, disarmed, and the small shaved girl stood among them holding a shock lance she had already decided she did not need, and she set it down on the deck carefully, the way you return a borrowed thing, and turned back toward the wing. "That's enough," she told them, the ones on the floor. "Tell Karsk it's enough. Tell him to come himself." Karsk watched it on the security feed, and for the first time in 416 instruments, the prefect of the integration wing felt the specific vertigo of a man discovering that the thing he owns has never once been his. He had built a career on a simple, reliable fact. The Directorate took the galaxy's most dangerous stock, the Deathworld natives, the ones whose worlds killed everything soft, the ones no council species could stand against, and it made them safe. It unthreaded their spines and laid Warship alloy in the channel and ran the leash through the alloy, and it turned the most dangerous thing in the galaxy into a tool that answered to a thumb on a slate. That was the whole science of it. That was why the Directorate had grown fat and unbothered across 100 harvested worlds. You did not fear a Deathworlder if you held its leash. He was watching now, a Deathworlder who held her own. She had walked through his security detail like weather through a fence. She had freed the wing. She had done it all without raising her voice, without a single moment of the fury he understood how to counter, and now she was standing in his corridor telling his broken guards to send for him, and Karsk Val understood that every certainty he had ever built his life on had been resting, the whole time, on a leash, and that the leash had never held the thing it claimed to hold. It had only held the ones they had already emptied. And the emptying, he saw now with the clean, cold horror of a man reading his own obituary, had never been control. It had been the Directorate cutting the fangs out of things too dangerous to leave whole, and calling the corpse an instrument and mistaking a corpse for obedience. Ren was not emptied, and Ren was, therefore, the first Deathworlder the Directorate had ever built and left whole, and she was loose in his station, and she was asking for him by name. He did not go to her. Frightened men in high offices do not walk into the corridor where the weather is. Instead, Karsk did what the Directorate had always done when a harvested world proved resistant. He stopped being soft. He keyed the wing's environmental controls, and he began, from his office high in the daylight, to pull the air out. "You want me to come myself," he said to no one, to the feed, to the girl who could not hear him yet. "I processed 416 of you. I'm not going to be the 417th mistake." He watched the atmosphere gauges on the wing begin to fall. "You're unbreakable. Congratulations. The ones behind you aren't. Let's see how unbreakable matters when the people you just freed start to suffocate and you can't take a single lungful of vacuum and give it to them." In the wing, the alarms changed pitch. The freed ones, the boy, the confused warrior caste builds, the half-returned humans from worlds under colors and numbers, felt the air begin to thin, and a new fear moved through them. The oldest one, the one that did not care how strong the girl in the corridor was. Ren felt the pressure drop against the alloy in her back. She turned to Tavrin at the theater glass. "He's venting the wing. He's venting the wing." Tavrin was already at the console, all four hands moving. "Environmental's a separate board, higher authority. I can't override it from here. A reconstructor's hand won't open it. Only the prefect's will. He's the only one who can stop it now." He looked at her, and there was something in the alien face she had learned to read. "Which means the only way to give these people their air back is to go get the hand that's taking it." Ren looked down the long, bright corridor toward the lift that went up, toward the office where the daylight went long and gold, toward Karsk Val. "Then that's where I'm going," she said. "Keep them alive while I'm gone. However many you can, that's your part now." "I built the leashes that emptied them." Tavrin's voice did not rise. "Keeping them alive is the only part I want." She went to the lift. Behind her, the surgeon who had unthreaded 8 spines began, for the first time in his life, to thread a body back toward being a person, sealing the wing section by section, moving the freed ones to the theater where the air still held, carrying the boy who could not yet walk right, doing with his 4 careful hands the exact opposite of everything they had ever done. And above them both, Karsk Val drew the air out of his own station and waited for the weather to come up in the lift, and told himself in the gold light that he still had 1 card left, and that this one the girl could not walk through. He had, after all, built more than one unbreakable thing. The lift stopped between floors, and the thing Karsk had built before her was waiting in the dark of it. Ren felt the lift halt Karsk's hand, high in his office, freezing the car between the wing and his floor, sealing her in a steel box the size of a small room. And then the panel behind her peeled open on a maintenance shaft, and something came through it that she recognized before she saw it, because it moved the way she moved. It was human. That was the first fact and the worst. A young man, a few years older than her, built broad where she was built small, and down the back of his neck ran the surgical line she wore herself, the mark of a spine unthreaded and replaced. His face was smooth and pleasant and empty in the good posture of the collar, and his eyes had the nothing behind them, the all-the-way nothing, the boy in the second-to-last cell but grown and finished long ago and never once flickering. Stenciled on the plate of the light rig over his heart, where hers said Sable 9, his said instrument Onyx. The 8th spine, the one before her, the one Tavrin had built and emptied and shipped, and Karsk had recalled from whatever world he'd been pacifying and brought home to be the card the girl could not walk through. "Onyx," Karsk's voice came out of the lift speaker, calm now, a man back on familiar ground. "Meet Sable 9. She's what you'd be if the reconstructor had failed on you the way he failed on her. I want you to correct that." I want you to put her down and hold her down until the correction team arrives, and I want you to understand that she cannot hurt you and you cannot be hurt, so this is only a question of which of you stops first." A pause. "Onyx doesn't stop, girl. That's what I built the 8th one for. Onyx never stops." The emptied man came off the wall of the lift and hit her, and the box the size of a small room became the whole world. He was exactly as strong as she was, and exactly as unbreakable, and he felt nothing, which for the first time in 4 days made Ren the one at a disadvantage. Everything she had done since the cradle she had done by finding the seam, the customs check in her own nerves, the knot in the leash, the nerve cluster behind a chitin plate, the exact narrow difference between terrible and survivable. But there was no seam in Onyx. He did not tire because the collar would not let him register tiring. He did not hesitate because there was nothing behind the nothing to hesitate. He was a wall thrown against a wall, and walls do not find each other's seams. So it was not clever the way it went, and it was not quick. It was the 2 hardest things the Directorate had ever built, in a steel box, taking each other apart and failing to, over and over, in a silence broken only by the koinon stone sound of alloy meeting alloy, and the low animal grunt of effort that even an unbreakable body makes. He drove her into the wall of the lift, and the wall dented. She turned his arm the way she'd turned the guard's arms, and it did not break, because there was Warship metal in it now. So she turned it further and further past where a joint gives, and the collar held him through the pain the way the alloy held her, and he did not stop. He got his hands on her throat. The weave over her throat held, a service round had flattened on it in the arena, but he was not firing a round. He was pressing, and pressing was patient, and Onyx was the most patient thing in the galaxy because the collar had taken from him the very capacity to stop. He pressed, and the daylight in the shaft above went gray at the edges of her sight, and Ren understood, with the cold, clear attention that never tipped into rage, that she was not going to win this the way she had won everything else. There was no seam in him. She could out-endure a bullet, a lance, a correction. She could not out-endure a wall that felt nothing and would never, ever stop. So she stopped trying to beat him. She let him drive her down to the floor of the lift with his hands on her throat and his empty, pleasant face above her. And instead of fighting the hands she reached, not with her arms, with the thing she had learned in the fire down into the cold, sure line of her own back. And then out, the way she had reached out through the wings junction, except there was no junction here, no board, no wire. There was only the alloy in her spine and the alloy in his, 2 lengths of the same Warship metal pressed close in a steel box, and Ren gambled everything she had left on the one thing the Directorate had never imagined because it had never once built 2 whole instruments in the same room. She reached through the metal. She did not know if it would work. She only knew that the alloy in her back and the alloy in his had come off the same keel, out of the same foundry, the same inert, unbothered material that would not conduct the Directorate's leash, and that if it would not carry the Directorate's signal, it might yet carry hers, the small, quiet one, the one the surge had taught her the shape of by being its opposite. Pressed spine to spine on the floor of a frozen lift, with the gray closing in at the edges of her sight and an emptied man's hands on her throat, Ren sent Onyx the same thing she had sent the wing. She sent release, and found there was almost nothing left in him to release. That was the cost, and she felt it in the moment she paid it, and it was worse than the correction. The leash let go. She felt it fall inert in his back the way it had fallen inert in the boy's, but where the boy had wept, where the boy had a person still folded up small behind the nothing waiting to be let out. Onyx had been finished long ago and finished thoroughly, corrected more than once, emptied down past the place where a person could be kept. When the collar let go, there was no one underneath to take the throat back. The hands on her neck simply loosened, because there was no longer a signal telling them to press, and no longer a self telling them anything at all. The most unbreakable thing the Directorate had ever built knelt over her in the frozen lift, freed, and had nowhere to go, because they had taken everywhere he might have gone. He looked down at her with the nothing in his eyes, and for one moment, something came up behind it, the way it had come up behind the boys, the flicker of a young man from a world under a color and a number remembering he had been young. His mouth moved. No sound came. And then it went out, not smoothed away by a collar this time, but simply gone, guttered like a lamp with nothing left to burn. And Onyx sat down slowly on the floor of the lift beside the girl he had been sent to put down, and folded his hands, not because a collar told him to, but because it was the only shape his body remembered, and was still. Ren lay on the floor of the lift and breathed her slow walking breath and looked at the emptied man she had freed into nothing, and did not weep, because weeping was the body arguing it should have been treated better, and she had learned long ago on a world under a color and a number that the argument does not bring anyone back. But she lay there a moment longer than she needed to. She would remember him. That was the only thing left to give him, and she gave it, and then she stood in the frozen lift over the 8th spine and put her hand on the shaft wall to steady the anger she was not going to let herself feel yet, and looked up toward the office where the daylight went long and gold. "Onyx never stops," Karsk's voice said, uncertain now from the speaker, because the feed showed him what had happened and he did not have a line in any report for it. The collar, that's not." "He stopped," Ren said. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "You built him to never stop, and I gave him the only rest you left him. That one's on you." She reached up, got her fingers into the seam of the frozen lift doors, and began slowly, with the strength of Warship metal in a small human frame, to pull them apart. "I'm coming up now, Karsk. You're out of unbreakable things. All you've got left is you." Karsk Val had never in his life stood in the same room as an instrument he did not hold, and when the lift doors he had frozen were forced open from the inside and the girl stepped into his office, he discovered that the feeling had a physical location. It sat behind the breastbone. It was very cold. His office was the highest room in the station and the brightest, a broad daylit chamber under a curve of glass, and beyond the glass, filling half the sky, the planet the station orbited turned slow and enormous and indifferent, a world the Directorate had already harvested down to compliance, its clouds white in the hard, clean sun. Karsk had chosen this office for the view. A prefect should be able to look down at a broken world while he worked. It had never once occurred to him to wonder how the view would feel with an unbroken thing standing behind him. "Recall cadence, Sable 9, he said, and thumbed the slate, and sent the code that was the last authority in the collar, not an order, not a correction, but the recall, the kill phrase, the signal that told an instrument's own alloy to lock rigid and drop it where it stood, the failsafe for the 1 in 1,000 asset that slipped the leash mid-deployment. He had used it twice in his career. Both times the asset had gone down like a felled tree. He sent it now into the keel steel he had ordered built, and he watched the girl's face for the falling. Ren's face did not fall. She walked toward his desk across the bright floor with the harvested planet turning behind him, and she said without heat, "I ate that in the fire, Karsk. Every signal your leash can send, I learned the night you tried to burn me out. The recall's just the loudest one. It goes into the wall in my back and the wall doesn't care." She stopped at the edge of his desk. "You keep reaching for the leash. There isn't one. There was never one that held me. You just couldn't see the difference between a thing that obeys and a thing you've already killed." Karsk did the last operational thing left to him. He keyed his personal detail, the 6 warrior caste guards who stood watch outside a prefect's office, the best the Directorate posted, hand-picked and loyal, and armed with the heavy sidearms that a prefect's guards carried. And they came through the doors behind her at a run, and Karsk gave the order he had given 100 times to end 100 problems. Fire. The office filled with the sound of it, 6 heavy weapons at close range in a glass room, and the rounds crossed the bright floor and reached the small shaved girl standing at the prefect's desk, and every one of them flattened and fell. Karsk watched it happen with the specific horror of a man seeing the physical law, He built his life on simply decline to apply. The round struck her back, her shoulders, the base of her skull where the surgical line ran, the places a trained detail put rounds to drop a target, and they made the small, bright coin-on-stone sound, a dozen of them, 2 dozen, and they rained down onto his office floor in a scatter of ruined metal, and the girl did not so much as turn to look at the men shooting her. She kept her eyes on Karsk. She let them empty their weapons into her back while she looked at the man who had ordered it, and there was no anger in her face, and the lack of anger was the most frightening thing Karsk Val had ever seen, because anger he understood, anger he could have used. This was just attention. The scale, watching the weight. "They're going to run out," Ren said over the noise mildly. "They always run out. Then it gets quiet and you and I are still standing here, and nothing's changed except now they know." She was right. The firing guttered and died as it had in the corridor, 6 trained warrior-caste guards lowering their weapons one after another because some old animal part of the brain will not keep feeding rounds to a thing that does not fall. In the ringing quiet the girl turned at last and looked at them. "Set them down," she said. "You saw the corridor detail. I don't kill people who stop. They set them down." A prefect's personal guard, hand-picked and loyal, laid their heavy sidearms on the bright floor of the highest office in the station and stepped back from them, because they had just watched the physical law the directorate ran on decline to apply, and there is a point past which loyalty cannot reach. Karsk was alone at his desk with the harvested planet turning behind him and a girl he did not hold standing in front of him, and he understood that he had reached that point himself some minutes ago, and had only now caught up to it. "What do you want?" the prefect said. It came out smaller than he intended. "3 things. Ren picked one of the ruined slugs off his desk where it had come to rest, turned it over, set it down. "First, you put the air back in the wing. The people you were suffocating to make a point, they get to keep breathing. That's not a negotiation. Your hand's the only one that opens that board, so you're going to open it, and if they die while you decide, then this stops being boring for you the way it stayed boring for the guards." She let that sit in the bright, cold room. "That one's now, Karsk. The other 2 can wait until they're breathing." Karsk looked at the girl, and at the scatter of dead bullets on his floor, and at the 6 sidearms his own guard had laid down, and at the planet he had liked to look down on, and he keyed the environmental board with a hand that was not quite steady, and gave the wing back its air. Far below, in the theater where a surgeon with 4 careful hands had gathered the freed, and the half-returned and the boy who could not yet walk right, the alarms changed pitch, and the pressure came up, and a dozen people who had spent their lives as inventory took a breath that no one had ordered them to take. Tavrin Yules had spent 40 years learning how to take a person apart, and in the space of one morning he was learning, badly and too late, how to put one back. The theater had become a shelter. He had sealed it against the venting while it lasted, and now the air was coming back, and the freed ones were scattered across the daylit floor in the postures of people who had been handed back their own bodies without instructions. Some sitting very still because stillness was all the collar had let them practice, some standing at the great glass wall looking down at the turning planet with an expression he had no word for, some simply weeping the way weeping is done by throats that have not been allowed to for years. 12 of them, 14, builds from 6 harvested worlds, and in the corner, wrapped in a thermal sheet that Tavrin had put around him with his own 4 hands, the boy. The boy's name was Imre. Tavrin had made him say it 4 times, gently, because saying it seemed to hold him in the world. Imre, 12 standard years, taken from a world under a color and a number, a world where the directorate filed the natives as stock, and the surgeons unthreaded the children young because young spines took the alloy cleanest. Tavrin had not built Imre, some other reconstructor of his caste had, in some other bright theater, with the same 4 careful hands and the same coward's deal. But Tavrin looked at the boy and saw every spine he had ever built, and he did not look away, because looking away was the thing he had done for 40 years and it was over. Home, Imre said again, in the language the translators did not listen for. He was learning that the word was allowed now. He said it the way a man says a word he is afraid will be taken back. Home, Tavrin agreed, in the boy's own language, which he had made the console teach him in the last hour because a builder caste learns fast when he finally wants to. Yes, home. I'm going to get you home. He did not know yet if it was a promise he could keep. But it was the first promise he had ever made to a thing he had helped build, and he found he would spend the rest of his life keeping it or die trying, and either outcome was cleaner than the 40 years behind him. Not all of them could be brought back the way Imre could. Tavrin moved among them with a medical scanner and a growing, sickening understanding of the arithmetic of what his caste had done. The recent builds Imre, 2 of the human women, a young warrior caste male, had been emptied only once, the initial seeding, and there was a person still folded up small behind the nothing, frightened and returning. But the older ones, the ones the directorate had held for years, corrected and recorrected each time a flicker of self surfaced, emptied down past the place where a self could be kept. There was one, a human man older than the rest, his surgical line long healed to a white seam, and his plate-red instrument Corvin. And when the leash fell inert in his back, he had come back only partway, enough to know he was a person, not enough to remember which one. He sat against the theater wall and looked at his hands and could not find the man who used to own them, and Tavrin knelt in front of him and scanned him, and understood that some of what had been taken was not coming back. That a self corrected too many times is not a locked door but a burned house, and that no amount of building he did now would unburn it. "I'm sorry," Tavrin said to Corvin, which was a thing his caste did not say to assets, and Corvin looked at him with the part-way eyes and did not know enough to accept it or refuse it, and that was the cost, laid bare in the daylight, and Tavrin made himself look at it. This was what the directorate called control. This was the corpse it mistook for obedience. He had built 8 of these before Ren, and he had told himself the first 8 didn't feel it, and here was Corvin against the wall to show him the exact shape of the lie. He would build Corvin back as far as Corvin could go. He would spend years on it. It would not be far enough, and Tavrin would carry that too. But he would not look away, and he would not call it obedience, and he would write it down, all of it, in the small, careful script of a caste that documents everything, and this time he would file it where it could be read. That was when the idea came to him, standing in the daylit theater among the returning and the half-returned, with the boy Imre saying home behind him and Corvin's part-way eyes in front of him. The idea that would finish what the girl had started, and that only a builder of record could do. The directorate ran on the story that it made Deathworlders safe. That was the whole architecture of it. The harvest world submitted, the council species paid, the fleet stayed fat and unbothered, all on the single reliable story that the most dangerous stock in the galaxy could be unthreaded and alloyed and leashed and turned into a tool that answered to a thumb. Every prefect, every board, every harvested world believed it, because it had always been true. Because the only Deathworlders they had ever seen after the process were the emptied ones, the Corvins, the corpses that mistook themselves for obedience. They had never seen a whole one. They had never seen Ren. And Tavrin Yule's builder of record had 40 years of documentation, every spine, every correction, every emptied cell, the whole true arithmetic of what the directorate did to the children of harvested worlds, filed flawlessly in the small, careful script of his caste, sitting in a records vault that a reconstructor's hand could open. He had built the lie in flesh for 40 years. He was, it turned out, also the only one holding the proof of it. He went to the theater console. His hands, all 4 of them, were steady now, in a way they had not been steady in a very long time. "Imre," he said without turning, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to keep saying your name while I work, out loud, so I remember what this is for." "Imre," the boy said obediently, and then catching himself, understanding for the first time in years that he did not have to be obedient, said it again, defiantly, louder his own. Imre. The surgeon began to open the records vault. "They're breathing," Ren said. She had felt it in a way she could not have explained to Karsk and did not try, a loosening somewhere below her, the wings' pressure coming up, the freed ones taking air. "Good. Second thing. You said the other two could wait." Karsk had gathered himself. A prefect did not stay a prefect by staying frightened, and the recall had failed, and the guns had failed, and the champion had failed, and Karsk Val was doing the thing his caste did best, which was to reach past the immediate ruin toward the larger board. "They can also, I think, be answered. You freed a wing of assets. You beat a security detail and my personal guard. Impressive. But you're a single unbreakable girl on a directorate station, and this station is one of 400, and above us there is a fleet, and behind that fleet there is a directorate that has harvested 100 worlds and does not lose. You cannot shoot your way out of that. You've proven you can't be shot. You have proven nothing about whether you can win." He straightened his gray cloak. "So let me offer you the adult version of this conversation. You want your people freed and sent home. I can arrange that. Quietly. A transport, a set of records adjusted, this whole morning filed as a containment exercise that went well. You disappear back to whatever world you came from with your dozen strays, and the directorate goes on and everyone lives. That is the deal on the table. It is a good deal. It is the only deal because the alternative is that I call the fleet, and the fleet does not care that you're unbreakable. The fleet burns the wing from orbit, strays and all, and files it as a loss." It was, Ren had to admit, a real threat and a real offer, and it was built on the one thing Karsk still believed, that this was a negotiation between a girl and a directorate, and that a directorate always had the larger board. "You think I want to disappear," she said. "I think everyone wants to disappear when the alternative is a fleet." "On my world," Ren said, "the directorate files us under a color and a number, AG-8, the red register. You send harvest teams and they don't come back, and you decided the answer was to take our children and unthread their spines and send them home wearing your collar, so the rest of us would watch our own kids put us down and stop fighting. That was your plan for us. I heard the board vote it." She had not raised her voice through any of it, and she did not raise it now. "You didn't take me to make one weapon, Karsk. You take a whole world's children and make them into hands that kill their homes. That's the business. That's what this station is. 12 of them were in that wing this morning. There are stations like this one over 100 worlds. I'm not disappearing. I'm going to make everyone see what this is." "See," Karsk almost smiled. "You're a girl in a room. Who is going to see?" "Everyone your reconstructor can reach," Ren said. "He's been documenting it for 40 years. Every spine, every correction, every emptied cell. He built the proof at the same time he built the collars because that's what his caste does. They write everything down. And right now he's opening the records vault and he's going to put 40 years of it onto every channel this station can touch. The fleet, the board, the council worlds that pay you to keep them safe from us. And the harvest worlds, all of them, AG-8 included." She watched the almost smile die on the prefect's flat gray face. "You built your whole business on one story, Karsk, that Deathworlders can be made safe, that you can unthread us and leash us and turn us into tools. And the only reason anyone ever believed it is that the only ones they ever saw afterward were the emptied ones. They never saw a whole one." She spread her hands, small and ordinary dead bullets scattered around her boots. "They're about to, on every channel. And once 100 harvest worlds see that the process you use to make us safe is the exact process that makes us into this, unbreakable, unleashed, standing in your highest office while your guns fall off, how many of them do you think keep submitting? How many keep sending you their children quietly, once they know the children come back like me?" Karsk Val stood in the highest office in the station with the harvested planet turning behind him, And for the second time that morning felt the cold thing sit down behind his breastbone, and this time it did not get up. Because she was right, and he was a man who could read the board, and he read it now with the clean, cold horror of a man watching his own arithmetic turn against him. The Directorate did not run on fleets. Fleets were expensive. The Directorate had grown fat precisely because it did not have to use them, because the harvest world submitted, because submission was cheaper than resistance, because everyone believed the one story. And the one story was about to die on every channel the station could touch. Not as a rumor, not as a resistance broadcast to be dismissed, but as 40 years of the Directorate's own flawless documentation, in the small, careful script of its own buildercast, narrated by a whole Deathworlder standing in a prefect's office letting the guns fall off her back. You could not burn that from orbit. It was already leaving. "Call the fleet," Wren said quietly, reading him the way the scale reads the weight. "Burn the wing. Burn the station. Do it while 40 years of your own records are going out on every channel, and give 100 harvest worlds the last thing they need to understand exactly what you are." She tilted her head. "Or put the slate down, Karsk, and start being the man who has to explain this instead of the man who caused it. Those are your two. I told you the other one could wait until they were breathing. They're breathing. So choose." Down in the theater, Tavern Yules opened the records vault, and 40 years of the true arithmetic of the Directorate. Every spine, every correction, every emptied cell, every child taken from a world under a color and a number, began to climb out of the station on every channel it could touch, toward the fleet, toward the board, toward 100 harvest worlds, toward the red register, carrying with it a single live feed from the highest office in the station. A small shaved girl, calm, standing in a scatter of dead bullets, and a prefect with his hand frozen over a slate he could not bring himself to press. Fleet Captain HFY had held station above the harvested world for 11 cycles, and she had never once expected the order to fire on the station she was guarding, and when it did not come, she understood before anyone on her bridge did that something in the Directorate had just broken and would not be repaired. The broadcast reached her flag bridge the way it reached everything, all at once, on every channel, unblockable because it came from inside her own network on the Directorate's own encryption, in the Directorate's own buildercast script. Her communications officer tried to kill it and could not, because you cannot refuse a signal that carries your own authority codes, and HFY sat in her command chair above a broken white world and watched 40 years of her own institution's arithmetic climb across her displays. She had known, of course. Everyone in the fleet knew, in the way you know a thing you have decided not to look at, the harvest, the instruments, the children of resistant worlds unthreaded and alloyed and sent home to end the resistance. She had escorted the transports. She had never watched the theater feeds. That was the arrangement the whole Directorate ran on, that the ugliness was done in bright rooms by careful hands, documented flawlessly, and never looked at directly, so that a fleet captain could hold station above a broken world and call it order. Now it was on every display, and there was a girl in it. HFY watched the live feed from the station's highest office, a small shaved human standing calm in a scatter of flattened rounds, a prefect with a frozen hand, and she watched the documentation scroll beside it, and she understood the thing the girl had built with terrible economy. The Directorate's story was that Deathworlders could be made safe. The proof of the story was the emptied instruments, the corvins, the corpses that mistook themselves for obedience. That was all anyone had ever been shown. And here on every channel was the thing behind the story, that the emptying was not control, it was cutting the fangs out, and that a Deathworlder built and left whole was not a tool at all. Was, in fact, this. Standing in a prefect's office with the guns falling off her back, unhurried, asking for terms. "Captain," her weapons officer quietly. "Station Command is requesting orbital fire on the integration wing. Prefect Val's authority. Do we?" "No," HFY said. Captain, the authority is. If we fire, she said, and she said it slowly so that her bridge would understand she had thought it through. We burn a wing full of freed children on a live feed going out to 100 harvest worlds to confirm every word of a broadcast we cannot stop. We would not be ending this. We would be signing it. She looked at the small figure on the feed, calm in the scattered metal, and something moved in Iyara set that she would spend the rest of her career reckoning with, a recalibration of everything she had held stationed to protect. The Directorate is not strong because it has fleets. It is strong because 100 worlds believe they cannot win, so they send their children quietly and we never have to use the fleets. That belief is what just died on my displays, and you do not unkill a belief by burning the room it died in. She keyed her own authority into the record over Karsk Val's, the first insubordination of a long and spotless career. Fleet holds, log it under my name, and send to the board all of it my recommendation appended. The harvest of AG-8 is not recoverable. Neither, I suspect, is the harvest of anywhere the broadcast reached, which is everywhere. She sat back in her chair above the broken white world and watched the girl in the office and thought, with the clean, strange awe of a soldier meeting the thing that ends her war. They told us we made them safe. We only ever made them quiet. And now here is one we forgot to make quiet. The board convened without being called, because a board that has just watched its founding story die on every channel does not wait for an agenda. They met in the daylit chamber high in the station, the ring of Directorate casts around the hollow well, the great filtered sun laying its bright bars across the table, and this time the well did not turn up a file on Sable 9. It turned up the live feed of her, standing in Karsk Val's office, and it turned up the broadcast still climbing out across 100 worlds, and it turned up, one by one, the responses beginning to come back in from the fleet, from the harvest worlds, from the council species who paid the Directorate to keep them safe from exactly the thing they were now watching stand calm in a scatter of dead bullets. The logistics cast who had read out AG-8's file a lifetime ago, 3 days before, spoke first, and his voice had lost all its distaste. The red register is broadcasting back, so are 11 other harvest worlds. They're not sending distress. They're sending the feed onward in their own languages with their own words attached. It's the resistance on AG-8 isn't asking us to stop the harvest anymore. They're telling the other worlds to make their children whole. On purpose. They're calling it, he stopped. They understand what she is. They understand that the thing we built to end their resistance is the thing that ends us, and they're spreading the instructions. The chamber was very quiet under the bright bars of sun. Then the harvest is over, said the eldest of the board, a slate-purple noble caste who had voted for 400 harvests and had the clean, cold sense to know the 401st would not happen. Not by our choice. It ended in a bright room this morning when a reconstructor we trusted opened a vault, and a girl we built stood up. The only question left to this board is whether we end it in a way that leaves the Directorate something to be afterward, or whether we call the fleet, burn the wing, and become on every channel the thing the broadcast says we are. He looked around the ring. I have voted for the harvest my whole life. I voted for hers. I am telling you that a Directorate which burns that wing does not survive the day, because 100 worlds are watching to see whether the story they just learned is true, and the story is that we cannot make them safe and we cannot make them afraid. Burning the wing answers the second half for them. Do not answer it. No one moved to call the fleet. That was the vote, though no formal vote was taken, the absence of a hand reaching for the slate, all around the ring, under the bright sun. The board of the station that had processed 416 instruments sat in the daylight and declined, for the first time in its existence, to reach for force, because force was the one move left that would finish them faster than the truth already was. Send to Prefect Val, the slate-purple elder said at last heavily. The board will hear the girl's terms, all of them. A pause, and something almost like the awe that had moved through the fleet captain moved through the old noble's voice, the recalibration of a caste that had spent its life certain. Tell him the board would also like to know how the whole of it, the wing, the guard, the eighth instrument, the vault, how the whole of it was done by one asset before midday, without her once raising her voice. He looked at the feed, at the small, calm figure in the scattered metal. I processed the paperwork on stronger stock than that for 40 years. I never once saw one of them look bored. She looked bored the entire time. I would like to understand a species that produces boredom in the middle of that. No one at the table had an answer for him. Up in the office on the feed, the girl was still waiting, unhurried, for a prefect to put down a slate, and the board watched her wait and understood that the waiting was itself the answer, and that they had never had a word for it, and that they were going to have to learn one. Karskval put the slate down. He did it slowly, the way a man sets down a weight he has carried so long his hands have forgotten any other shape, and when it was on the desk, he took his hand off it and stepped back, and the small distance between the prefect and the slate was the largest thing that had happened in the room all morning. He did not look defeated. He looked, Ren thought, like a man doing arithmetic he had refused to do for a very long time, and finding the answer had been the same the whole while. "The board wants your terms," he said. "All of them. They're listening now." He gestured without irony at the feed at the daylit chamber high in the station where a ring of casts sat around a hollow well and watched. "You've made your point about the fleet. No one's reaching for it. Congratulations. You've done a thing no harvested world has done in the Directorate's history. Now tell them what it was for, before the story going out on those channels writes its own ending without you in it." Ren looked at the feed. She had never in her life spoken to a board, and she found she did not need to learn how, because she had nothing to perform and nothing to plead, and a board that has already lost is the easiest room in the galaxy to be plain in. "3 things," she said to the feed in the plain voice. "The first 2 are done. You put the air back in the wing, and the truth's on every channel. Nobody can unknow it now. This last one's for the record so you understand it isn't a request." She picked up one of the flattened rounds from the desk, turned it over in her small scarred fingers, set it down. "Strike Ag 8 from the Harvest Register. My world. The Red Register. No more teams, no more transports, no more children unthreaded. Not because I beat your guards this morning. I don't care about this morning. Because you've seen what happens when you build us whole, and you've seen what your own people did to the ones you didn't. Corvin's in that wing right now with a burned-out house where a man used to be, because you corrected him until there was nothing left to correct. That's what your control is. That's the corpse you've been calling obedience for 416 names. I'm the one that didn't take. And every harvest world just watch me not take." She let it sit. "So here's the arithmetic, since your board likes arithmetic. Keep harvesting Deathworlders and either you empty us, and now everyone's seen what the emptied ones cost, so the world stops submitting and you have to use the fleets you can't afford, or you build us whole, and you get more of me. There is no version of the harvest that ends with you fat and unbothered. There never was. You just couldn't see it until one of us stood up in the room." In the daylit chamber, the slate-purple elder inclined his head, slowly, the cast's gesture of a debt acknowledged, and Ren understood she had won the way she had learned to win on a world under a color and a number. Not by being stronger than the thing across from her, but by outlasting its certainty until it did the arithmetic itself. "The board strikes AG8 from the register," the elder said, and his old voice carried out across 100 channels, which was the point, which was why Ren had made him say it on the feed. "And the board will convene on the harvest program entire. I will not pretend to you, girl, that we do this out of conscience. We do it because you have made the harvest cost more than it pays, and a directorate is a ledger before it is anything else. But it is struck." A pause. "You should also know that we cannot unempty the ones already emptied. Your Corvin, the others, that is beyond our craft and beyond your reconstructors and beyond, I think, anyone's. Whatever you take home today, you take home the way it is." "I know," Ren said. "I'm not asking you to give them back whole. You can't. I watched one of them find that out on the floor of a lift this morning." She thought of Onyx, the eighth spine, folding his hands in the frozen car because it was the only shape his body remembered, and she did not let it show on her face, but she carried it. I'm asking you to stop making more. That one you can do, so do it. The board did it. It was struck into the record, on every channel, in the Directorate's own authority. The harvest of AG-8 ended, and the whole program remanded for review, which in the language of a ledgercast facing 100 watching worlds meant ended in every way but the admitting. Karsk Val stood by his desk with his hand a small distance from the slate, and watched the arithmetic he had built his life on close its books, and Wren turned to him, and for the first time all morning she looked at him not as a weight but as a man. "You're wondering why I haven't touched you," she said. He had been. It had sat behind the cold thing in his chest the whole time that she had walked through his guards and his champion and his fleet threat and never once come around the desk. "It's because I know what you'd do with it if I did. You'd want me to. A girl who walks through everything and then breaks the prefect's neck at the end, that's a monster, and a monster's easy. The board could file that. The harvest worlds could fear that. You'd get to be right about us on the way out." She stepped back from the desk. "I'm not going to make you right. You're going to stand in this office you liked for the view, and you're going to watch 100 worlds learn what you did, and you're going to keep breathing through all of it, the way you made a wing of children keep breathing this morning after you tried to take it from them. That's the only thing I'll ever take from you, Karsk. I'm going to leave you exactly as alive as you left them, and let the rest of it arrive on its own." She walked to the lift, past the 6 laid-down sidearms, past the scatter of dead bullets, and she did not look back at the prefect, because the scale does not look back at a weight it has finished reading. Behind her, Karsk Val stood in the highest and brightest office in the station, with the broken white world turning beyond the glass, and discovered that the cold thing behind his breastbone had a name after all, and that the name was not fear. It was the rest of his life. 3 jumps away, in a canyon the color of rust, the broadcast came down out of the storms and found a world that had stopped expecting anything from the sky but harvest teams. Sella of the Rust line was on the rim watch when it came, because someone was always on the rim watch, because a red register learns young that the sky is where the taking comes from. She was 19 now. She had been 14 when they took Wren, and grief on a Deathworld ages you in whole cycles at once. And she had a patched receiver cobbled from a downed harvest ship, and she was listening to the dead Directorate channels the way the Resistance always listened, for the schedule of the next taking, when the dead channels came alive all at once with something that was not a schedule. It was every channel, it was unblockable. It was the Directorate's own authority carrying the Directorate's own arithmetic, 40 years of it, in a careful alien hand, and Sella did not understand the half of it, the build specs and the correction logs and the emptied cell counts, but she understood the feed that ran beside it, because the feed was a room, and in the room there was a girl. Sella knew her. 200 days had not been enough to forget the small shaved shape of the rust line girl they had sent up in a harvest hold and mourned as dead, because nobody came back from the spine work, because everybody knew that. And here she was on every dead channel at once, standing in some bright high room in a scatter of flattened metal, calm, unhurried, while things that had to be guns went off around her and fell away like hail off stone, while a prefect stood frozen with his hand over a slate he could not press, while a whole institution's story came apart behind her in its own careful handwriting. "Get the elders," Sella said to the boy beside her on the rim watch, and her voice did not sound like her own. "Get everyone, get them to the receiver." She could not take her eyes off the feed. "Wren's alive. They took her for the spine work and she's alive, and she's not." She stopped, because there was no word yet on the rust line for what Wren was, because the Directorate had spent 400 years making sure there wasn't. "She's standing up. Go, now." The whole settlement came up out of the buried habs and crowded the receiver in the rust-colored dark, and they watched a daughter of the rust line stand in a prefect's office and speak in the plain flat canyon voice they all knew, Strike AG8 from the register, my world, the red register. No more teams, no more transports, no more children unthreaded, and they watched a slate-purple alien elder say back to her, on every channel, that it was struck. And the rust line, which had buried more children than it could count under markers in its yards, which had been told for 400 years that the sky only ever took and never gave back, stood in the dark and watched the sky give one back, not emptied, not a weapon, not the sight that was meant to break their will, but whole and cold, and entirely their own, turning an empire's arithmetic back up its own wire in a voice they had taught her. Nobody cheered. That was not the rust line way. A world that killed everything soft did not waste breath on the sound of hoping. They watched in the hard silence of people recalculating everything they had been sure of, the same silence that was falling in that hour across 100 harvest worlds receiving the same feed. And when it was over, when the broadcast looped back to the beginning to climb outward again, one of the elders, old enough to have buried her own children to the harvest, old enough to have stopped expecting the sky to do anything but take, said the only thing anyone said aloud that night, in the rough canyon tongue, quietly, to no one and to everyone. "She's coming home," the old woman said. It was not a question, and it was not quite a hope, and it was not quite a certainty. It was the plain, flat fact of a world that had just learned, after 400 years, that some things came back. Get the yard ready. Adami's daughter is coming home, and she's not coming home alone. Wren came back down to the wing the way she had left it, in the lift, and this time the lift ran because no one on the station was in any condition to stop it, and the eighth spine still sat on the floor of the car where she had freed him into nothing. She had not moved Onyx on the way up. There had been no time and no point. Now she knelt beside him in the running lift and looked at the young man they had built before her, the one Karsk had recalled to be the card she could not walk through, and she thought about the flicker that had come up behind his eyes for one moment, and then guttered out with nowhere to go. He was still breathing. The finished ones went on breathing. That was the cruelty of it. The body kept its habits after the self was gone. He would need carrying. He would need a bright room and careful hands and years, and he would not, Tavrin had told her across the feed, come all the way back, because a house burned to the foundation is not a locked door. "You're coming too," she told him, though there was no one home to hear it. "Whatever's left, you're not staying here." She got an arm under him and lifted, and the warship metal in her frame made a grown man light, and she carried the eighth instrument out of the frozen car and down the bright hall toward the theater, past the cells that stood open and empty now, past the stencils that said things no one would ever obey again. The theater, when she reached it, had become the strangest room she had ever stood in. 14 people who had spent their lives as inventory were scattered across the daylit floor in the middle of the hardest morning any of them would ever have, and a four-armed surgeon moved among them with a scanner and a gentleness his caste did not issue. And at the great glass wall, a boy named Emre stood looking down at a turning world and saying his own name to it, over and over, quietly, defiantly, as if daring the glass to take it back. Tavrin looked up when she came in carrying Onyx, and something crossed the alien face, and he came and took the young man from her arms with 2 of his 4 hands, carefully, the way you carry a thing you have broken and mean to spend your life mending. "You freed him," Tavrin said. It was not a question, and it was not quite an accusation, and it was not quite a thanks. It was a builder caste looking at the 8th spine he had made and emptied and understanding, at last and completely, what emptying was. "I freed what was left." Wren watched him lay Onyx down against the wall beside Corvin, the 2 of them, the burned houses, side by side in the daylight. It wasn't much, but it was his, and now it's his again, even if there's no one home to know it. She looked at the surgeon. "You did the vault." "I did the vault," Tavrin straightened. Around them, on a dozen quiet displays, the truth of 40 years was still climbing out across the station, and the fleet in 100 worlds, unstoppable now, self-propagating, the harvest world sending it onward to each other in languages the translators had never been told to listen for. It's out. It won't come back in. Whatever the directorate is after today, it's not the thing that could harvest your world quietly, because quiet is the only way that ever worked and quiet is gone. He looked at the boy at the glass, at Emre saying his name to the turning planet. The board struck AG8, I heard it on the feed, and they'll strike the rest, not because they've grown a conscience overnight but because you made the ledger say to. That's enough. That's more than 40 years of my caste managed. One morning. One morning and a wall in my back you built, Ren said. You keep leaving yourself out of it. Tavern Yules looked at his 4 hands, the hands that had unthreaded 8 spines and 1 girl's, the hands that had opened a vault, the hands that were even now cradling the ruined 8th instrument he would spend the rest of his life trying to build back toward a person. I built the collar, he said simply. I built 8 before you and emptied every one. Corvin is against that wall because a surgeon of my caste did to him exactly what I did to Onyx, and told himself exactly what I told myself. Whatever I do from here, I don't get to be a man who wasn't part of it. I only get to be a man who stopped. He met her eyes. So I'm going to be that. I'm going to take these people home, the ones with homes to take. I'm going to spend the years it takes to build Corvin and Onyx back as far as they'll go, which won't be far enough, and I'm going to keep going anyway. And I'm going to teach the harvest worlds the one thing my caste knows that's worth anything, which is how the collar's built, so that if the directorate ever forgets what it learned this morning, there's a surgeon on every Deathworld who knows exactly how to make sure it never takes. A pause. If you'll have a reconstructor on your world, I'd understand if you wouldn't. I'm the reason there's alloy in your spine. Ren was quiet a moment. Behind her, Imre said his name to the glass. In front of her, 2 burned houses sat side by side in the daylight, and a wing of the returning stood scattered across the floor learning how to own their own hands. The alloy in my spine, she said, is the reason 100 worlds are going to stop sending their children to have their spines taken. You built the wall they couldn't leash. You didn't mean to, but you did, and then when it counted you opened the vault instead of signing the order, and that's the only part I get to judge you on because it's the only part you chose. She looked at him, the scale done reading. Come to Agate, build them back, teach the surgeons, bring the boy home. She almost smiled and did not because a slight smile was a thing she saved. And write it down, all of it. In your small, careful hand. Somebody has to be the one who documents what we are, and it turns out your caste is good at that, and it turns out I'd rather it be a true record than let them write their own. The surgeon looked at the girl he could not empty, and then he did a thing his caste did not do, a thing that had no field in any report, a thing he would have to invent a word for later. He bowed, 4 hands folded, crest lowered, the whole narrow frame of him inclined toward a small shaved human standing in a scatter of dead bullets, in the way a builder caste honors the thing it has made that has surpassed the making. I'll write it down, Tavern Yule said, every word. Starting with yours. The transport that left the station 3 hours later was a directorate hull with directorate markings, and Fleet Captain Iyira Set let it go. And in letting it go she understood she was ending the directorate as surely as the girl aboard it had. It was a medical transport, requisitioned by a reconstructor's authority, and loaded with 14 freed instruments and 2 who would never be fully free, and it lifted out of the station's bay into the hard, clean sun, and turned its nose away from the broken white world and toward the long dark between. Iyira had 100 weapons that could have unmade it in a breath. Her orders, the standing orders, the ones no one had rescinded because the man who could rescind them was standing motionless in his high, bright office watching 100 worlds learn his name. Her orders said to hold no asset transport without manifest clearance, and this one had none. She let it go anyway. She had made her choice on the bridge an hour ago, and she found that a choice like that, once made, keeps making itself. "Captain," her communications officer, quieter than before. "The transport is broadcasting. Open channel. It's the reconstructor. He's still transmitting. The records, the whole vault, but he's added to it now. Build specifications, the collar, how the lattice ties into the alloy, he's teaching. He's sending 100 harvest worlds the exact method for making sure the process never takes on their children again." A pause. "Do we jam it?" "With what authority?" Iyra said. "His codes are still valid, half of it's already gone, and the other half." She watched the little medical hull dwindle toward the dark, carrying its cargo of the returning. "The other half is the only mercy left in this. If the worlds know how the collar works, no directorate that ever reforms can build it again in secret. He's not just freeing the ones aboard, he's inoculating the galaxy." She sat back. "Let it transmit. Log it under my name with the rest. I'm already the captain who didn't fire. I may as well be the captain who didn't jam either. History can have both on one line." She watched until the transport was a point and then nothing, and then she opened a private channel, low power, aimed at the dwindling hull, and said the thing a fleet captain of the directorate was never supposed to say to a freed asset, the thing that was itself a kind of surrender. "Transport, this is the flag, you're clear of my envelope. No pursuit will originate from this fleet, that's not a courtesy, it's an order I've already signed and I'll answer for it." A pause, and then Iyra Set, who had held station above a broken world for 11 cycles and called it order, said the plain true thing. "We spent 400 years certain we'd made your kind safe. We only ever made them quiet. Go be loud." She closed the channel before anyone could answer, because there was no answer she was owed. Aboard the transport, Wren stood at a viewport and watched the station fall away, and she did not feel the thing she had thought she might feel, which was triumph, because triumph was for people who had been afraid, and she had spent 4 days deciding not to be. What she felt was tired, in the specific way of a body that has been very cold for a very long time and is only now in the falling away, allowing itself to notice. The alloy in her back was still a wall. It would always be a wall now. There was no unthreading it, no giving her own spine back, and she had made her peace with that on the cradle in the first hour, the way you make peace with a thing that is simply true. She would carry Warship metal in her for the rest of her life. She would carry the 8th spine, folding his hands in a frozen lift. She would carry Corvin's partway eyes, and the boy in the second-to-last cell saying home before he knew it was allowed, and 416 names she had never read. But she would carry them home. That was the difference. That was the whole difference, and it was enough. "You should rest," Tavrin said beside her. He had a way of arriving quietly for a creature with 4 arms. "The frame carries the load, but something has to keep standing in it while it does. That part's still yours. That part still tires." "You wrote that down in the arena." She had read it, the vault was open, everything was readable now. "It's the truest thing in your whole record." "It's the truest thing I learned in 40 years, and I learned it from watching you stand in a crush frame at 11 and tell it that it would run out of numbers before you ran out of standing." Tavrin looked out at the dark with her. "I put it in every file after that. The examiners thought I meant the alloy tolerance. I meant you." Across the transport's small hold, Imre had fallen asleep against the bulkhead. Finally, the boy's face slack with the particular exhaustion of a self that has been carrying itself alone for the first time in years, and has just now been allowed to set the weight down. One of the freed human women had put a thermal sheet over him. Corvin sat where Tavrin had settled him, looking at his hands, and Onyx sat beside him, not looking at anything, and the 2 burned houses kept each other a kind of company that neither of them could name, and both of them, Wren thought, could somehow feel. "They'll want to know, on my world," Wren said, "why you're on this ship, a surgeon of the caste that took their children. They'll want to open you up and see what's inside the way you opened us." She said it without malice, as information, the way she said everything. "It won't be easy for you. Bringing the children home doesn't buy you clean. You'll have to earn it every day in front of people who have every reason to hate the sight of your hands, for years." "I know," Tavrin did not look away from the dark. I built the collar for 40 years. Earning it every day for the rest of my life is the lightest sentence I could possibly draw, and I know it, and I'll take it, and I won't complain because Corvin doesn't get to draw any sentence at all. There's not enough of him left to hate me properly, and that's worse than anything your world could do to me. He was quiet a moment. I'll build them back. I'll teach their surgeons. I'll write the true record. And when they look at my hands and hate them, I'll let them because they're right too. And because a man who spent 40 years being wrong doesn't get to also decide when the being wrong is over. Your world decides that. If they ever do. Ren looked at the four-armed surgeon who had built the wall in her back, and then, when it counted, opened a vault instead of signing an order. And she thought about the difference between a thing that obeys and a thing you've already killed, and the difference between a man who was part of it and a man who stopped. And she found she had spent so long learning to read weights that she could read this one clean. They'll hate your hands, she said, and then one day some of them won't, the ones you build back, the ones whose children you bring home whole. It won't be all of them, and it won't be soon, and you don't get to ask for it. A pause. But it'll come. That's the other thing about my world you should know since you're going to live there now. We're a red register. We're supposed to be the ones who can't be anything but resistant, but the reason your teams never came back isn't that we can't stop hating a thing. She watched the dark. It's that we can't stop deciding every single morning whether today's the day we start letting something change. That's the Deathworld trait your directorate never had a file for. Not that we're unbreakable, that we keep choosing. Even you'll get a chance to be chosen. Eventually. If you keep earning it. Tavrin Yule stood beside her at the viewport with the dark going by, and did not answer, because there was no answer he was owed, and because his eyes, all of the many eyes of a builder cast, had gone bright in a way that had no field in any report, and he did not want the small, careful voice to break in front of the girl he could not empty. He would write that down too later, that she had told him on the way home that he would be chosen, and that she had made it sound like the hardest and most ordinary thing in the world, which, he was beginning to understand, on a world under a color and a number, it was. The world the directorate filed as AG-8 came up out of the dark 3 days later, and it did not look like a red register from orbit. It looked like weather. Ren watched it grow in the viewport, a hard blue and brown world wrapped in storms, its northern reaches white with ice, its equator a belt of dust and canyon, a world that killed everything soft and had therefore raised everything that did not stay soft. Somewhere down there was the settlement she had been taken from, a scatter of buried habs in a canyon the color of rust, and somewhere down there were the people who had raised a girl to stand in a crushed frame and tell it that it would run out of numbers before she ran out of standing. She had left this world in a harvest team's hold, sedated inventory. She was coming back at the front of a transport full of returned children, with a directorate surgeon at her shoulder, and 40 years of the truth already burning across 100 worlds ahead of her. The resistance met them before they made atmosphere. They came up in the ugly patched interceptors. The red register had cobbled together from 3 cycles of down-harvest ships. The ships that never came back. Ren understood now, because her world had been taking them apart and learning them. And they ringed the transport with weapons hot, because a directorate hull dropping toward the canyons was the single most hated sight on the whole hard world, and they had every reason to burn it out of the sky. "Hold," Ren said, into the transport's open channel in the language of the canyons, the language the directorate translators did not listen for. "This is Ren, Adami's daughter from the Rust line. They took me 200 days ago. I'm coming home, and I'm not coming home alone, and I'm not coming home the way they wanted." There was a long silence on the channel. Interceptors held their ring, weapons hot, a world's worth of hatred aimed at a directorate hull. Then a voice came back, young and hard and careful, a voice Ren knew, Sella, from the Rust line, who had been 14 when Ren was taken and would be older now, because that was what 200 days did. We saw the broadcast. We saw a girl who wears your face standing in some far room with the guns falling off her. That's not proof it's you on that hull. Weapons still hot. The Directorate has all our faces and every reason to send one back at us wearing a friendly voice. So if you're Ren, the real one, the one from the Rust line, tell me what's buried under the third marker in the yard. The thing only Ren would know. Ren almost smiled. A tin box, she said. Your brother's tin box that you buried the day the first harvest team took him 3 cycles ago so you'd have something of his to dig up if he ever came home. He never did. You made me swear I'd help you dig it up the day he came back or the day we stopped waiting. A pause. I'm not your brother, Sela, I'm sorry. But I've got 14 other people's brothers and daughters on this ship, and 2 we couldn't bring all the way back, and one of them's 12 years old and his name is Imre, and he's been saying his own name for 3 days straight because he only just learned he's allowed to. Let me land. Let me bring them home. And then help me dig up the tin box because I think today's the day we stopped waiting. The channel was silent. The interceptors held their ring. And then, one by one, the weapons went cold, and the ugly patched ships of the Red Register fell into escort around the Directorate hull, and brought it down through the storms toward a canyon the color of rust, where a world that killed everything soft had been waiting 200 days to find out whether anything ever came back from the spine work. They landed the transport in the Rust Line yard, and the whole settlement came up out of the buried habs to meet it, because word had gone ahead the way word does, and the ramp came down into the hard, bright canyon daylight, and the returned children of a dozen worlds walked or were carried down it into the arms of a world that had been told, for 400 years, that its children only came back as corpses that mistook themselves for obedience. Emre came down the ramp on his own feet, which he had been practicing for 3 days, and at the bottom he stopped, because there was no one there for him. His world was not this one. His people were 3 jumps away under a different color and a different number. And for one terrible moment the boy stood at the bottom of a stranger's ramp in a stranger's canyon, and understood that home was still a long way off. And then Sela, hard young Sela of the Rust Line, who had buried a tin box and waited 200 days, walked out of the crowd and knelt down in front of the boy who was not her brother and would never be her brother, and said, in the rough canyon tongue, gentling it as best she could, "You said your name for 3 days straight. I heard. Say it for me. Then I'll take you inside and you'll eat and we'll get you home to your own people, but say it first, so I know who I'm helping." Imre, the boy said. Imre, Sela agreed and stood and took his hand, and led him down off the ramp into the crowd, and the crowd took him the way a Deathworld takes anything it has decided to keep alive completely, and without asking permission, and as if it had always meant to. Ren came down the ramp last, because the one who brings people home comes down last, and she stood in the rust-colored daylight of the world that had raised her, and the world looked at her, at the small shaved girl with the surgical line at the base of her skull, and the wall of Warship metal where her spine used to be, and the world did not know, at first, what it was looking at. They had sent a girl to be harvested. The Directorate had promised to send her back a weapon, an emptied thing, a hand that would put down its own home. That was the whole plan. She had heard the board vote it. And here she was at the bottom of the ramp, whole, calm, unhurried, with 14 returned children behind her and a Directorate surgeon at her shoulder and 100 worlds already burning with the truth she had set loose. And the plan had not just failed. The plan had been turned all the way around and driven back up the wire, the way she had driven the correction back up the wire in the dark, until it became the exact opposite of itself. They had tried to make her the sight that broke her world's will. She had come home the sight that would break the Directorates. The harvest did not end all at once, because nothing that large ends all at once, but it ended. It ended the way a dam ends, a seam first, then a crack, then the whole face of it going at once. Ag 8 was struck from the register the morning Ren stood in Karsk Val's office. That was the seam. Within a cycle, 11 more harvest worlds had refused their quotas, sent the harvest teams home empty or not home at all, and posted Tavern's build specifications on every channel they could reach, so that the surgeons of 100 worlds learned exactly how the collar tied into the alloy and exactly how to make certain it never took. That was the crack. And when the council species who had paid the Directorate for 400 years to keep them safe from Deathworlders watched the recordings, the girl in the office, the guns falling off, the whole true arithmetic in the Buildercast's own careful hand, they stopped paying, because you do not pay to be kept safe from a thing by the people who have just demonstrated they cannot keep you safe from it and never could. That was the face of the damn going. The Directorate did not fall in a battle. There was no fleet action, no last stand, no armada answering an SOS. It simply stopped being able to afford itself. The way a lie stops being able to afford itself once enough people have seen behind it. And it drew back from the harvest worlds one hull at a time, and the harvest worlds took their canyons and their ice and their storms back, and began, slowly, to become the thing the Directorate had spent 400 years making sure they never had the chance to be, which was themselves. Wren did not lead any of it. She was asked to A World Does Strange Things with a girl who comes home from the spine work hole, and there were those in the Rust line and beyond who wanted to make her a banner, a general, a name to march behind. She declined all of it, in the plain, flat voice, the way she declined everything she did not intend to carry. She had not walked out of a Directorate station to become a different kind of thing that told people what to do. She helped where helping was cold and useful. She taught the Resistance what she had learned about the collar from the inside. She stood at the front of the ships that went to strike other stations' wings and bring other worlds' children home. She was the sight, on a dozen worlds, that showed the harvest teams exactly how the arithmetic had turned. And then she went back to the Rust line, every time, because a person who has been made into a weapon and refused it does not get to spend the rest of her life being one anyway, even a righteous one. Tavern stayed. He set up his bright room in a buried hab in the canyon the color of rust, and he built the returned children back, one careful spine at a time, undoing what his cast had done, not unthreading the alloy, that could not be undone, but quieting the collars for good, teaching each body that the wall in its back was its own now, and answered to no one. The recent builds came back. Emre went home to his own world, 3 jumps away under a different color and a different number, on a ship full of his own returned people, and he said his name to Sella at the ramp before he went, and Sella said it back. And that was a thing that happened between 2 children of 2 Deathworlds that the Directorate had a file for neither. Corvin did not come all the way back, neither did Onyx. Tavern had told her they wouldn't, and they didn't, and he spent his years on them anyway in the bright room, teaching 2 burned houses to hold a cup, to walk a straight line, to sit in the sun. And some days one of them would look at the surgeon with the part-way eyes, and something would move behind the nothing and not quite become a person, and not quite fail to. And Tavern would write it down, every time in the small, careful hand, because someone had to document what they were. And it turned out he was good at that, and it turned out he would rather it be a true record than let anyone write their own. The world hated his hands for a long time. Wren had told him it would, and it did, and he let it, and he did not ask for it to stop, and he earned it every day in front of people who had every reason to hate the sight of a Directorate surgeon in their canyon. And then one day, years on, longer than either of them had guessed, a woman of the Rust line whose son had come home on Wren's first transport, a boy who now ran the canyon rims fast and whole and loud, brought Tavern a cup of the bitter root tea the Rust line drank, and set it down beside him in the bright room without a word, and left. And Tavern Yules, builder of record, sat with the cup going cold in one of his 4 hands and understood that he had just been chosen, a little, for the first time, and that Wren had been right about that too, and he wrote it down. They dug up the tin box the first week. Wren had promised, and Wren kept her promises the way she kept everything, coldly and completely, So on the first week she went out to the rust-lined yard with Sella and a shovel, and they dug under the third marker in the hard rust ground, and they brought up the tin box that Sella had buried 3 cycles before, the day the first harvest team took her brother, so she would have something of his to dig up when he came home. He had not come home. He would not. The box had been buried too long ago, before anyone knew how to bring anyone back, and the boy it belonged to was 3 cycles gone into the emptying and past even Tavern's craft to reach. Sella held the tin box in the rust-colored daylight and did not open it for a long time. "He's not coming back," she said finally. "Not a question, the plain flat thing. The ones from before, the early ones, they're gone all the way. Your surgeon can't reach them." "No," Wren said. "He can't. Some of it doesn't come back. I watched one of them find that out on the floor of a lift." She stood beside Sella in the yard where the settlement's children were running the rims loud and whole, the returned among them now, and she did not soften it because Sella had not asked her to. "We didn't win everything. We were never going to. They took 400 worlds worth of children before I ever stood up, and most of those aren't coming back, and yours is one of them, and there's no arithmetic that makes that anything but what it is." A pause. "But we stopped it. There won't be a box like this buried in the rust-lined yard again, because there won't be a harvest team to make one necessary. That's not enough. It's just what there is. And on a world like ours, you learn the difference between enough and what there is, and you learn to live in the narrow space between them, the same way you learn to live in the narrow space between terrible and survivable." She looked at her friend. "Open the box, Sella. He want you to have it back, even if he can't. That's what it was for." Sella opened the box. Inside the box there was a carved stone bird, no bigger than a thumb, worn smooth on one side where a boy's hand had held it. Sella's brother had made it in the long dark of a canyon winter, the year before the harvest teams came. It was not much. It was a small, ordinary thing, the kind of thing a body earns before it is ever harvested, and Sella held it in the rust-colored daylight and closed her hand around it and did not weep, because weeping was the body arguing it should have been treated better, and the rust line had learned long ago that the argument does not bring anyone back. But she kept the bird. That was the only thing left to give him, and she gave it, and then she put the empty box back in the ground under the third marker, because a world like theirs does not throw away a thing that has held something it loved, even when the thing it held is gone. Wren watched her friend fill in the hole, and thought about the bird her own hands had never carved, and the boy in the second-to-last cell, and the 8th spine folding his hands in a frozen lift, and 416 names she had never read and now never would, because most of them were gone all the way, before anyone learned how to bring anyone back. She carried them. She would always carry them, the same as she carried the wall of Warship metal in her spine, not as a wound she was waiting to heal, but as a weight she had decided to keep, because some weights you keep on purpose, so that you never forget the exact price of the ground you are standing on. The wall in her back was hers now. That was the thing the Directorate had never understood in 400 years of building them, that a spine is not a leash even when you make it out of the same metal, that the strongest thing in a body was only ever going to answer to the body it belonged to, and that when you take the most dangerous stock in the galaxy and make it unbreakable, the one thing you have guaranteed is that it will never again break the way you need it to. They had put a wall in her to make her theirs. They had only ever made her more completely her own. She stayed on the world that raised her. She did the cold, useful work, and then she stopped doing it, when the harvest was ended and the children were home and the ones who could come back had, and she let the banner makers find someone else to march behind, because she had refused to be a weapon, and she was not going to spend her one life being one anyway. She learned the canyon rims again. She helped Tavern in the bright room, some days, sitting with Corvin and Onyx in the sun, saying their names to them the way Emre had said his to the glass, on the chance that somewhere behind the nothing something was still listening and just could not yet answer. She did ordinary things, in an ordinary body that happened to have a warship in it, on a hard, bright world that killed everything soft, and had therefore raised the one thing the galaxy could not make obedient. And when strangers came to the Rust Line, traders, now in the years after, because a world you cannot harvest is a world you must eventually simply talk to, and when those strangers heard the story and looked at the small, ordinary woman with the surgical line at the base of her skull and asked her, the way strangers always asked, whether it was true, whether she was really the one, whether the bullets had really fallen off, she never performed it for them. She never showed them. She would look at them with the scale's eye attention, the weight already read, and she would answer the same plain way every time, in the flat voice that had stopped a prefect's office and freed a wing and turned an empire's own arithmetic back up the wire. "They took my spine to make me obey," she would say. "They gave me a wall so I couldn't be broken and ran their leash through it because they thought the strongest thing in a person is the easiest thing to own." She would let it sit the way she let everything sit. They had it backwards. The strongest thing in a person was never the spine. It's the part that keeps standing in the frame while the frame takes the load, the part that decides, every morning, terrible or survivable, whether today's the day something changes. You can't build that out of metal. You can't leash it. You can only kill it and call the corpse obedient and hope nobody ever meets the one you forgot to kill. Then she would go back to whatever ordinary thing she had been doing in her ordinary body, on the hard, bright world, unhurried, her heart walking its slow, patient walk. And the strangers would leave and carry the story on to the next world, and the next, the way the truth had carried out of the station on every channel it could touch, until there was no world left that did not know the plain, flat lesson of the one they forgot to kill. You do not own a thing by making it unbreakable. You only teach it, all the way down to the metal, exactly how much it was always meant to be its own.